Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a quiet space where time slows down, where questions linger longer than answers, and where the deep rhythms of Earth are allowed to speak at their own pace. Tonight, we are going to drift steadily into the first of many mysteries, one that has rested in the minds of dreamers and scientists alike. What if the ocean itself remembers? Not only the tides and the salt, but the very stories. What if every wave folding and falling still carries the echo of creatures long gone, civilizations we cannot prove, and whole chapters of life erased from the land but preserved in water's endless archive? It may sound like a thought best left to myth, like something ancient storytellers would whisper upon the shore at night. But if we sit with the question, if we don't rush to dismiss it, if we allow it to hang in the silence between words, it begins to feel less like fantasy and more like possibility. Before we go further, I'd like to ask you gently, where are you listening from right now? Are you close to the ocean, where on certain days the air drifts heavy with brine, and gulls cry overhead like echoes of older waves? Or are you far inland, where the idea of the sea feels more like memory than experience, where it exists only in imagination, like a word you cannot taste but somehow still know? Wherever you are, I wonder, when was the last time you stood at the edge of water and simply gazed downward, into the darkness below? Was it a lake, a river, the shallow foam of a shoreline? Do you remember that quiet pause as you looked down, when part of you wondered, what waits beneath this reflection? Almost everyone has felt that moment, a fragile silence that arrives unplanned, when we sense that the surface may be hiding something vast, something older and stranger than we expect. The oceans of the Mesozoic were not the same seas we know now, yet their presence would have felt familiar. Salt, current, depth, silence. But filling that silence were worlds we can barely imagine. Forests of coral stretching upward to meet the light, shelled ammonites drifting in great spirals, predators with eyes adapted to dim green glow. To believe the oceans may carry memory is to entertain the idea that even now, as waves strike rock and fall away, there is a deeper resonance, an afterimage that belongs not to us, but to the earth itself. Could it be that water remembers forms in ways rocks and soil cannot? Not because it holds images like a picture, but because it bears chemistry, isotopes, traces that remain long after flesh turns to dust. Geology reminds us that rocks do not forget easily, and fossils are proof that death leaves outlines strong enough to survive entire eras. But oceans are stranger than stone. They cycle, they renew, they erase, but they also keep. In tiny chambers of calcium left behind by plankton. In deposits buried deep in subduction trenches where seabeds sink into the crust. In silt that settles one layer at a time, creating a patient, slow archive. Science tells us these things, and yet, in the calm of night, it's hard not to wonder whether memory in water is something more than data or mineral record. Could memory feel like rhythm? Could it drift like current? Could it be that the sound of waves themselves are echoes ancient in nature, repeating frequencies of events so old our species cannot measure them? And then comes the question of silence. Oceans, vast as they are, absorb. They swallow sound as surely as they swallow light. There is a humility in that, a reminder that not all memory is spoken. We think of silence as absence, but what if silence is a form of remembering too? A reservoir where everything collapses into stillness. Perhaps extinction events, the vanishing of entire lineages of life, were not erased but folded into silence that still hums quietly, if we only knew how to hear it. Of course, there is skepticism. Maybe oceans do not remember at all. Maybe waves are just mechanics of wind, water, and physics. Maybe every trace of ancient life is long dissolved, lost forever. And yet, we know fossils lie hidden under the sea. We know isotopes carry record of oxygen, temperature, atmosphere. We know whales today still sing low notes that can carry across entire basins. Maybe memory is not a story told in sentences, but a chemistry carved in cycles. A spiral like an ammonite, a rhythm repeating, always repeating. And this leaves us with a gentle opening, one that invites us further. If the ocean can remember without words, without shape, without even silence breaking the surface, then what else might it be cradling still? If even this much can be carried forward through deep time, then maybe the oceans hold not only the bones of giants and the patterns of shells, but deeper truths, whole chapters of life and history lost to human eyes. And if that is so, what might we have forgotten resting even now beneath salt and depth, waiting in the quiet patience of forgotten seas? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The seas that came before the dinosaurs were already vast with breath, already woven with stories too deep for land to hear. Long before the thunder of footsteps shook the earth, the oceans carried their own awakenings, slow, patient, and filled with creatures that tested the edges of possibility. Corals raised delicate scaffolds toward the sunlight filtering down through the surface, tiny architects building empires of limestone that would one day harden into cliffs. Ammonites, with their spiraled shells, drifted on the currents like living calendars, each whirl etched with growth, loss, and survival. And in their company, simple fish, some armored in bony plates, others agile and sleek, moved as if learning to write the first sentences of movement in an endless blue library. What makes their lives remarkable is not only what they became but also what they left behind. Within their shells, within their bones, within the microscopic husks of plankton falling like snow to the sea floor, lay a subtle record written in chemistry. Not words, not voices, but isotopes, oxygen ratios, carbon traces, mineral fingerprints that still persist within ancient rocks. When scientists today look into those records, they are not merely counting atoms, they are listening to whispers of the world as it once was. Was the sea warm or cool? Was the air breathing more oxygen or less? Did currents carry abundance or famine? In the simplest of forms, the first breath of ancient seas lingers, coded not in memory as we know it but in matter itself. It is humbling to imagine that every breath we take carries echoes of those early oceans. The oxygen we pull into our bodies each night and release in our sleep was once circulated endlessly through seas that predate us by hundreds of millions of years. When we inhale, we share not just with the present air but with a lineage of breath shared by trilobites, by ammonites, by creatures lost to extinction but not to silence. Perhaps this is what ocean memory truly is. A cycle so immense, so unbroken, that life is never completely absent, only rearranged. And if water carries these breath marks across epochs, it leads us to an unsettling but beautiful thought. What else hides in its depths, too subtle for us to read yet still written all the same? Could the pattern of tides, repeating ceaselessly, be an echo as old as the first coral reefs? Could the subtle drift between warm and cool oceans trace not just climate cycles but the emotional pulse of the planet itself, rising and falling like a sleeping mind? We often picture deep time as a vast silence punctuated by sudden drama, but the oceans suggest something softer. They remind us that history can be continuous rather than catastrophic, that warmth and nourishment, growth and decay, all fold themselves into an unbroken ribbon of change. Entropy touches everything. Reefs collapse, shells dissolve, bodies fall to silt, but entropy too becomes part of the memory. Not absence, not erasure, but a different kind of archive. And as those first oceans took their breath, long before any tree rooted or bird sang, they preserved secrets even in their loss. On some level we sense this. Standing by water, watching ripples spread and vanish, we feel that something more is happening beneath the surface. Not because the water speaks, not because it holds language, but because it carries rhythm, and rhythm itself can remember. If the first breath of the sea still lingers in every fossil, every isotope locked in stone, then perhaps we are not only observing history but inhaling it, carrying it, becoming it without knowing. And if breath can be carried across these immense gulfs of time, untouched by endings, then what else might the ocean still be holding for us to rediscover? And yet, if this one inhale from the beginning has lasted so long, what happens when silence itself takes its breath? To follow the steady inhale of the first oceans, we drift now toward one of their most iconic keepers of time, the ammonite. Their shells, coiled in geometry so perfect it seems intentional, rise from stone like frozen whirlpools, spirals caught mid-turn, galaxies in miniature. Each curve is both ordinary and infinite, carrying the mark of growth cycles repeated like the tides themselves. To hold an ammonite shell in your hands, even today, is to cradle a spiral of memory that reached across millions of years, a shape unchanged as it multiplied through eons of ocean life. There is something hypnotic about that curve, almost as though it is speaking directly to us. The spiral does not rush. It expands slowly, predictably, one chamber at a time. Carries patience built into its form. Growth, pause, growth again. Inside those chambers, the animal adjusted itself, creating balance between buoyancy and depth. A mathematical perfection serving a biological necessity. Each new curve allowing it to float, to rise, to fall like breath. The shell was not only armor but instrument, tuned to the conditions of the sea, recording pressure, temperature, even chemistry. The spiral is no mere ornament. It is a timeline, a record, a built-in archive of life lived in rhythm with the tides. When we look at the fossilized spirals today, it is hard not to imagine them as clocks. Yet these are not clocks of minutes or hours. They are clocks of survival. Each new chamber is evidence of a life that continued when conditions permitted, of persistence when entropy could so easily have won. Could it be that the sheer abundance of ammonite shells, collected in cliffs, washed into shales, scattered across mountains, remains one of the most eloquent memories left to us by the Mesozoic Ocean? Spirals repeating, endlessly repeating, like echoes of time itself refusing to vanish. And there is metaphor in this too. The spiral has always carried meaning. In galaxies, in storms, in shells, in fingerprints, it draws us inward and outward at once. To stare into an ammonite is to feel a pull between scales of time too large for us to hold. You can trace the shell with your eyes and imagine yourself moving outward, through epochs, through extinctions, through transformations too immense to catalog. And yet you can also follow the spiral back inward, into silence, into origin, into the first breath of life that dared to create such symmetry in the dark ocean. Could it be that the ammonite offers us not just a fossil but a philosophy, a meditation on cycles, rebirth, and inevitability? Geologically, these creatures charted ages. Entire rock layers are defined by particular ammonite species, their appearance and disappearance framing vast chapters of deep time. Their isotopes carry the whispers of ocean temperatures, salinity, and atmospheric shifts. In their death, they became markers, signposts of epochs. They are guides, telling us how warm the sea was, how rapidly the climate changed, how life adjusted or failed to. And all the while, their spiraled shells remind us that history itself, the memory of a planet, rarely travels in straight lines. It curls, it loops, it turns upon itself before gently drifting outward again. And yet there is tragedy folded into beauty. By the end of the Cretaceous, ammonites had disappeared completely. An entire lineage, erased in silence after surviving cycles that seemed eternal. Their spirals stopped spinning, frozen mid-curve in stone. In that stillness we feel the fragility of memory, how even the most enduring forms can vanish overnight when the world shifts too violently. Still, the echo of their absence teaches us as much as their presence. Sometimes what is gone remains just as telling, just as alive in imagination, as what survives. And so we hold their spirals today not simply as patterns, but as mirrors. They teach us about time, about loss, about the quiet resilience of form and rhythm. They remind us that everything turns, everything cycles, everything eventually returns to silence. Perhaps the spiral itself is universal for this reason. It reflects not only what ammonites once were, but what time itself feels like in its endless recursions. Not linear, not final, always circling, always echoing. And if even a shell can carry the shape of galaxies, storms, and fading breaths, then maybe the patterns we call time are not external to us at all, but woven through us already. The ammonites remind us softly, you are also part of this spiral. You breathe, you grow, you change in cycles unfolding at scales too subtle to notice in the moment. And when silence one day comes, as it did for them, your spiral, too, will echo in ways you cannot yet imagine. And yet, if an entire lineage whose shells once numbered beyond counting could vanish so completely, what else has circled here before us, leaving nothing but erased patterns we cannot yet see? Reefs have always had the quality of cities, living architectures rising slowly, polyps upon polyps building upward toward the light. In the oceans of the Mesozoic, these reefs were empires of stone and color, vast and breathing fortresses where fish sheltered, ammonites circled, and predators traced shadows above. To drift among them then would have been to move through cathedrals of living rock, chambers glowing with tiny sparks of life, a silence so complex it was never still. And yet, like empires on land, these underwater metropolises grew, thrived, and, in time, collapsed. They were not permanent. The proof lies in crumbled limestone scaffolds we find today, sealed inside cliffs, buried deep in strata that carry the rhythm of rise and ruin. What makes these vanished reefs remarkable is the way their history is preserved not in stories, but in stone. When we see fossil reefs exposed in canyon walls, they are no longer bright or teeming, yet their architecture remains, a testament to how grand their designs once were. Layer upon layer of coralline fragments, pressed and fossilized, whisper of their former tenants. Sea urchins grazing on surfaces, bivalves rooted in niches, fish sheltering from pursuit. But more than their living forms, the reefs left behind a silence we are meant to read carefully. Silence not as emptiness, but as warning. An absence etched deep enough that it speaks louder than presence. Climate belonged to them as much as to the creatures that lived upon them. Shifts in temperature, in acidity, in the circulation of seawater, all carried consequences. Too much carbon in the oceans, and coral skeletons weakened. Too much warmth, and mutual bonds with tiny algae, the microscopic partners that fueled reef life, unwound, dissolving the architecture of resilience. Entire empires of reefs vanished when oceans tipped out of balance. Their cathedrals dissolved grain by grain, leaving behind only rubble plains and shadows of what once was. And still, after collapse, the sea tried again. New reef builders rose, new empires shimmered into being. The pattern was always the same: flourishing, fading, silence, return. Perhaps this rhythm of resilience tells us more about time than permanence ever could. What we learn from these reefs is that memory is not about things lasting forever. It is about the way fragments persist. Nothing remains whole, and yet enough endures for rebirth to begin. Balance is temporary, resilience is fragile, and collapse is not the end, but one more chamber in the spiral of time. Could it be that the true lesson of reefs is not their grandeur while alive, but their endless willingness to begin again after each silence? Geologists can trace this by the stone itself. Under microscopes, the tiny frameworks of coral skeletons are revealed, patterned like latticework, each pore where a polyp once sat. Isotopic evidence inside them speaks of the chemistry of ancient seas, shifts in oxygen, carbon, the weight of vanished climates. The very skeleton of a reef is an archive, balancing between the intimate and the infinite. A single coral once fluttered, fragile, feeding under light, and yet, multiplied by millions, they formed structures visible even from space, whispering to us across epochs. Balance is fragile, and collapse comes quietly. If reefs rose and fell like empires, then what is it they ruled? They were not conquerors. They did not claim. They became sanctuaries by existing networks of shelter and safety built without intent. Perhaps this is why their silence after collapse feels so haunting. It is the absence of a generosity we could not replicate. Today, living reefs still pulse in tropical waters, scattered inheritances of their Mesozoic ancestors. But their fate reminds us of memory's fragility. Every empire ends. Every architecture, no matter how splendid, is borrowed against time. And so the twilight of every reef feels less like disappearance and more like transformation. Their ghostly frameworks infused into sediment, stone, and the chemistry of oceans yet to come. Not because they chose to endure, but because matter itself insists on keeping record. In this way, even silence becomes an archive of the reef. The absence of color and life is itself a shape, a form, a message. Balance is never guaranteed. And so, drifting from one dissolved coral cathedral to another, we are left to wonder. If even the mightiest ocean empires could fall in quietness, leaving nothing but whispers in limestone, what else lies waiting in those ruins of stone? hidden in the silence of time's patient archives. The twilight of reefs fades into another silence, and in that silence we begin to sense movement. Shadows gliding through green waters, bodies vast and certain, apex hunters shaped not by choice but by the endless sculpting of pressure and hunger. In the Mesozoic seas, two great lineages of predators rose into this role. The mosasaurs, massive lizards returned fully to the water, and the ichthyosaurs, sleek forms echoing something like dolphins, though older and stranger. They were not simply creatures. They were symbols of dominance, the ocean's answer to the question of how power moves through the slow theater of time. Their bones, now silent in stone, tell us stories not just of anatomy, but of competition, of the delicate line between mastery and disappearance. And perhaps most of all, they invite us to ask, how long does dominance truly last in oceans that remember more than we do? Mosasaurus itself carried the weight of a giant reptile adapted entirely to the sea. Up to 50 feet long, jaw lined with conical teeth, propelled by limbs that had become paddles. It was strength converted into fluidity, the land's power softened into a hunter's glide. Ichthyosaurs, on the other hand, mirrored another path. Their bodies evolved into streamlined torpedoes, large eyes adapted to dim depths, a life of speed and precision rather than brute strength. Two designs of predation, two experiments written into Mesozoic waters. One heavy, the other swift. One overwhelming, the other made of silence and accuracy. To imagine oceans filled with these shadows is to imagine an arena where hunger itself was a language. Mosasaurs diving, ichthyosaurs pursuing, schools of fish scattering like ash at their approach. Yet beneath the power was always fragility. These hunters could not escape the laws of entropy. Their reigns, however complete they seemed in the moment, were temporary. Competition shaped them, but extinction erased them. The ocean, always recording, kept their forms in limestone, but not their presence in the water. We are left only with bone, shadow, suggestion. When paleontologists examine their fossils, they do more than trace anatomy. They read isotopic signatures of diet, the wear patterns on teeth, the distribution of body sizes within layers of rock. From these fragments emerges a vision of predators locked in balance with prey, locked in balance with oceanic chemistry, locked, finally, in balance with impermanence. It is humbling, almost unsettling, to realize these creatures that once ruled vast seas left no descendants. They were apexes without heirs, peaks of mastery that vanished when the rhythms of Earth shifted out of pace with their designs. Is this what dominance means in the ocean? Not permanence, but immediacy. A flare of control, a mastery that lasts only until silence arrives to claim it. And isn't this what the sea always teaches us? That there are no thrones, only moments? No rulers, only temporary harmonies? Every predator shadow, no matter how perfect, eventually dissolves into memory. Today we speak of orcas, of sharks, of whales as ocean lords, but even they will pass. What seems eternal is only paused, suspended in one era, waiting its turn to give way. The bones of mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs curl in cliffs and quarries to remind us of this rhythm. They whisper that dominance cannot outlast change, that the ocean accepts no single empire forever. There is poetry hidden even in their form. The ichthyosaur, an image shaped like the modern dolphin, though they are not related, reminds us nature repeats itself, reaching for efficiency as though memory lingers in patterns of muscle and bone. The mosasaur, heavier, more reptilian, recalls to us the land it once abandoned, a body halfway between worlds. How strange that both vanished, while their forms remain etched in imagination. Could it be that extinction itself is another kind of shadow, one that lingers as deeply in the ocean as any hunter ever did? When we hold their fossils today, we feel two truths set against each other. One, that life can adapt into shapes beyond belief, fierce, elegant, brilliant in design. And two, that extinction spares no throne, no king, no shadow, no ruler. Dominance is at best a stanza in the longer poem of the planet, a line written strongly but soon replaced. And so, in the silence of vanished predators, questions echo. If creatures so vast, so tuned to mastery, could vanish completely, What does that say of our own place in time's spiral? Could our mastery, too, be nothing more than a pause, a fragile peak in an indifferent ocean of memory? When we picture those shadows moving beneath the water, we are invited not into fear, but into humility. Apex is only ever temporary. Silence remains. And yet, if even these shadows of power vanish so completely, what of the smaller lives that supported them, the tiny patterns beneath their size? What stories still linger in the sand, where forgotten bodies once settled and became archives of stone? Erosion is often imagined as loss, as wearing away, as absence steadily growing larger. But in truth, it is also a form of storytelling, quiet, patient, unhurried. The oceans of the Mesozoic were not only stages for predators and reefs, they were vast engines of sediment, slowly gathering the remains of lives too small to notice and turning them into chronicles. Sand spilled from river mouths, settling on the seafloor where currents softened it into new textures. Plankton shells, invisible to the naked eye, drifted down in a slow snow, piling until they became chalk cliffs white as bones. Fine shales formed in moments of still water, preserving delicate imprints of bodies that otherwise would have vanished without a trace. Each particle, each layer, each seam of stone was gathered from time itself, and together they became archives deeper than any script humanity has ever written. When we stand before a cliff of chalk today, it seems solid, monolithic. But what we are really seeing is compaction of billions upon billions of individual lives. Coccolithophores, single-celled organisms with fragile calcium plates, fell gently to the seafloor over millions of years. They were too small to be counted in their own time, yet collectively powerful enough to raise entire landscapes. Every grain is an echo, every layer a verse. Perhaps this is how Earth remembers. Not in sweeping lines, but in quiet repetition, in patience so extreme it feels like silence. Erosion did not erase these whispers. It arranged them, pressed them, revealed them when seas receded and winds uncovered their faces to the air once more. Sandstone tells another story. Made of rivers and deserts feeding grains into the ocean, it forms when particles wear down, fracture, and settle. The rounded edges of each sand grain are themselves a record of travel, splintered from rocks older than the seas around them, worn down by their relentless journey. In this way, sandstone holds within it a memory not just of the ocean, but of entire continents feeding into water, mountains shrinking one breath at a time. To press your hand against sandstone is to touch histories carried across landscapes, ground down by time and gravity into grains fine enough to slip through fingers. What language could match the quiet persistence of such record-keeping? Marine shales, dark and fine, are even more intimate. They form in calm, oxygen-poor basins where bodies of fish, ammonites, and plankton drifted down and settled without disturbance. Encased in silt, sometimes they remained intact, their outlines preserved as delicate shadows pressed flat. When broken open millions of years later, these shales reveal entire ecosystems. An ichthyosaur skeleton, brittle but complete. A fish school frozen mid-swim. A paper-thin beetle wing that once skimmed the ocean's surface. Erosion, over time, releases these stories back to air, breaking the stone open to reveal voices almost too soft to believe still survive. How strange that what wears away also reveals, that destruction is also record, that absence becomes storyteller simply by changing shape. Perhaps erosion is not so much loss as translation, translating worlds that are long gone into languages we can still read. A ripple pattern fossilized in sandstone might look like nothing more than texture. But to those who linger with it, the ripple is the echo of a current, a momentary sigh of water across a shallow seabed more than 100 million years ago. In the hands of deep time, even small motions are granted eternity. And yet, erosion raises humbler questions too. How much has been lost that no record, no grain, no trace remains? For every fossil bed, how many uncountable lives vanished without sediment to shelter them? The patience of stone is not universal. Many stories were never written and never will be. This reminder holds weight. Silence is also a record, but not one we can always decipher. Maybe that is the truest memory of all, that time does not preserve evenly. Still, what remains is extraordinary. Chalk cliffs glowing in moonlight above the English Channel, their pale faces born from microorganisms too small to see. Sandstones of Colorado and Utah carrying mountain dust from vanished summits. Shale layers in Germany or Lebanon that hold entire fish as though painted into stone. These are chapters erosion carved for us long before we had words. They are reminders that the earth remembers in its own quiet ways, that history is written not only by what survives intact but by what is ground down slowly, grain by grain, into something new. And so, as we listen to the eroding voices of chalk, sandstone, and shale, it becomes clear we are not witnesses to destruction, but apprentices to an archive. To trace a hand along such stone is to touch something older than memory, deeper than language, quieter than even silence itself. And if this is what erosion reveals, then we cannot help but wonder. What else lies within the layers, waiting for the right fracture, the right wind, the right hand to uncover its hidden story? Extinction comes quietly in the ocean. It does not arrive with fanfare or thunder, but with chemistry, with subtle imbalances, with patterns shifting until life can no longer hold itself together. In the Mesozoic seas, as in every chapter of Earth's story, moments of abundance were folded suddenly into silence. Creatures that once thrived under reefs and currents found their thresholds tested. Oxygen falling below the levels they required, waters warming just enough to push symbiosis apart, carbon dissolving into acid that turned skeleton to frailty. Each of these shifts began invisibly, molecule by molecule, until the rhythm of life snapped and whole communities dimmed out like lanterns without fuel. When we speak of extinction, we often imagine singular events, moments of sudden obliteration. Yet the oceans tell us extinction is also a slow drowning, an unraveling that is less an explosion than a whisper. Oxygen depletion, what scientists call anoxia, was a recurring shadow in Mesozoic seas. When circulation faltered, when deep waters grew stagnant, vast stretches turned breathless. Fish suffocated in darkness, plankton collapsed, and the intricate mesh that reefs and predators relied upon fell into silence. Other times, warmth itself became the destroyer, heat shifting currents, altering nutrient flows, unraveling bonds between corals and the algae that lived inside their tissues. What might seem like narrow margins in chemistry became vast divides between living seas and silent ones. These extinction pulses remind us that life is deeply entangled with balance, and the ocean's balance is carved by forces beyond anything creatures could resist. Acidification washed through waters when volcanic gases surged, carbon dissolving into the sea and stripping the very skeletons from builders. Reefs reduced to rubble, mollusks dissolved before they could grow. Entire lineages disappeared forever, leaving only scattered traces, isolated survivors that drifted onward into altered seas. The silence that followed was not barren, but empty enough to remind us how fragile even the grandest ocean empires truly were. Fossils tell these absences as clearly as they tell presences. Layers rich with shells abruptly give way to barren bands of mudstone. Tooth marks and abundance vanish to emptiness, replaced by silt fine and colorless. It is as if entire voices were silenced mid-song, not gradually fading but cut off by an invisible hand. And yet, beneath the grief, there is rhythm. Extinction is not interruption only, it is part of the larger cycle of persistence and renewal. Each silence clears space for something else to rise. Each collapse allows another architecture of life to assemble itself. Still, the silence can feel overwhelming. To imagine drifting through a Mesozoic reef at the edge of collapse is to imagine currents moving through frameworks already empty, coral skeletons still present but lifeless, algae banished from their tissues, color drained into ghostliness. Predators would have passed through these ruins, shadows searching for prey that was no longer there. The soft hum of a once-living city replaced by the unsettling quiet of vacancy. Perhaps this is why we struggle to think of extinction as normal, because in its stillness, we feel something personal, something unsettling in the hushed absence of voices that once surrounded the sea. And yet, the ocean seems to know this rhythm more intimately than we do. It has carried loss in every age and still continues. It has absorbed extinction into its memory the way it absorbs light beyond a certain depth, folding it, keeping it, turning absence into echo. The silence left behind by Mesozoic extinctions is not emptiness, but reminder. Time is patient, entropy is certain, and life persists not in permanence, but in recurrence. These extinction pulses remind us that endings can be part of the larger breath of Earth itself, that silence can be as telling as sound. And so, when we listen to the oceans today, rich with species but trembling at the edges of imbalance, we cannot help but wonder. How many more silences are nestled inside the rhythm of deep time, waiting to unfold again, when the chemistry of the seas once more shifts? Fossilization is not so much preservation as it is transformation, a slow alchemy of matter and memory. In the oceans of the Mesozoic, where soft bodies vanished almost as soon as they touched the seabed, bones and shells were the fragments that endured, the islands of calcium upon which entire records came to rest. Creatures dissolved into the deep, flesh-feeding scavengers, skin torn by currents, but teeth and bone remained. Over time, water seeped into their porous structure, replacing original minerals with new ones, molecule by molecule, until what was once alive became indistinguishable from stone. And yet, in that silence, a new permanence was born. It is strange to touch calcium today and recognize it as story, as language written into the archive of the Earth, still legible after tens of millions of years. The bones of marine reptiles, like mosasaurs or plesiosaurs, settled into seabeds where sediment buried them layer by layer. Their bodies vanished, but impressions endured, the subtle ridges of a jawbone, the fine curvature of a flipper. Over eons, deposition turned sediment to rock, and what was once a living predator became an artifact of patient substitution. Even their teeth, sharp and glinting in their day, became signatures of hunger pressed into chalk, a fossil ink that confirmed what kinds of lives they lived. Predator and prey alike hardened into permanence, evidence not of survival but of having simply existed. But fossilization also captured what was nearly invisible: the fragile spirals of ammonites, the filigree of corals, the intricate plates of microscopic foraminifera. Whole landscapes of calcium carbonate assembled in silence, locking away the details of ancient seas. Each tiny structure, multiplied across billions of lives, accumulated into cliffs of limestone and chalk that rise over coastlines today. The very hills and mountains that shape our landscapes are the bodies of the ocean's memory, uplifted by tectonics, revealed by erosion, whispering of Mesozoic waters far beneath our feet. It is tempting to think of fossils as static, but they are more than still images. They are echoes at once intimate and cosmic. A single shell pressed into stone recalls one creature in one moment, yet collectively these shells trace the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. A fossil is never just about the individual. It belongs to the memory of the sea itself, a piece of continuity plucked from entropy and fixed so the future can see. This permanence is not life itself, but the invitation of life into matter's endurance. Could it be that, in these calcium relics, we glimpse not only biology but philosophy, an answer the planet gave to its own silence? Geologically, fossilization is rare. Most bodies dissolve into nothing. Most voices are lost even before they can deepen into layers. What survives, what calcifies, are exceptions, accidents, islands of order against the tide of entropy. And yet, those rare remnants become models for everything we think we know. Our sense of the Mesozoic, our reconstructions of its oceans, our imaginings of the creatures themselves, all of it rests on this fragile mineral language. We are deciphering books that are mostly missing, piecing together volumes from islands scattered in the sea of absence. And still, we draw meaning. We tell stories, because silence hardens in the fossil, and silence, even fractured, is enough. There is beauty, too, in the way fossilization fuses life to geology. A plesiosaur vertebra becomes limestone, yet its form persists. An ammonite spiral is filled with quartz or pyrite, yet the shape endures untouched. To look into these pieces is to see death transfigured into art, a record not only of anatomy but of wonder. The alchemy reminds us, while nothing lasts, nothing is fully gone. Matter replaces matter, Silence replaces voice, and permanence, however illusory, allows us to read what would otherwise be lost. And when we walk coastal paths where chalk cliffs meet the sea, or when we hold in our palms an ammonite spiral to perfection, we are touching both ocean and time. Calcium, once alive, hardened into testimony. The ocean wrote itself into stone, and stone carries that script to us, long after the writers themselves dissolved. Perhaps this is why fossils are so awe-inspiring. They are not only remnants. They are reminders that loss itself can leave behind meaning, that disappearance can crystallize into memory strong enough to outlast the very seas that created it. And yet, if silence can harden into permanence, what about the forms that left no fossil, no calcium, no echo pressed into stone? What voices of the ocean remain forever unrecorded, their chapters scattered into nothing before we could ever learn their names? Ammonites spiraled their memory into stone, each chamber a whisper of vanished oceans. They left behind echoes delicate yet enduring, forms we read like seashell poems from a world we never saw. But if ammonites recorded the prehistory of seas, we cannot help but wonder, what records will we leave in turn? Our time is brief compared with the Mesozoic, and yet already the oceans carry our marks. Not spirals of calcium, not coralline frameworks of reef-building creatures, but plastics, alloys, concrete, and unfamiliar composites. Strange artifacts of an accelerated age. Where ammonites became guides to epochs, could our age become legible through the fossils we never intended to make? Scientists call them technofossils, pieces of technology churned into future strata, tokens of an industrial pulse that struck Earth in the span of moments compared to deep time. Tiny spheres of microplastic settle into mud. Fragments of bottles and nets sink into the seabed, slowly encrusted with barnacles, oyster shells, and films of bacteria. Bits of rubber and glass scatter across deltas, ground down into grains indistinguishable from sediment until studied carefully. Steel alloys and aluminum casings weather but persist, their structures impervious to processes that long dissolved ancient reefs. Could these fragments truly become our legacy, the shells and bones of our species etched not by design but by neglect? Plastics themselves are peculiar in this equation. They do not fossilize in the traditional sense, yet they persist. A fragment buried under sediment may remain for thousands, even millions of years, pliant traces turned brittle with time. One day, uplift may carve out a cliff where bright specks of once-colored polymers glitter in stone like false fossils, artificial shells that never sheltered life. Will a future geologist, human or something else entirely, hold a shard of hardened plastic the way we cradle ammonites and feel reverence? Or will they read it only as debris, a polluted scar carrying stories of imbalance rather than continuity? And then there are the alloys. Aluminum, unheard of in natural persistence on ancient Earth, now scattered across oceans in shipwrecks, aircraft debris, and machinery eroded by salt, but destined to outlast wood, bone, even coral. Concrete structures disassembled by waves may become reefs of their own, co-opted by marine life into new architectures, half artifact, half ecosystem. Perhaps these too will harden into fossils, blocks and beams reimagined as stone, catalogued not as creation but as strata. Is it possible that our most enduring monuments are not the statues we raise toward the sky but the debris we let slip into the sea? In this way, we unearth a strange mirror. Where ammonites left spirals of elegance, perfect in form, our technofossils may be chaotic. Scattered residue, irregular fragments adrift in sediments. Where ancient coral refracted sun into color, our remnants may darken into tarry residues of oil and polymer. Oceans do not discriminate, they will archive whatever they receive. But how the future reads this archive depends on the patience of curiosity. Will those who open a layer of rock and find plastic threads preserved in shale see them as the signature of a civilization brilliant yet careless? Or will they consider them the first tentative strokes of an intelligence just beginning to understand its place in time? It is unsettling, perhaps, that our memory may not belong to books or art or even cities, but to detritus. The detritus shaped from petroleum, scattered in runs of carbon like an unintentional diary, written in materials too stubborn to decay quickly. And yet, there is also a poetry to this inevitability. For even technofossils are part of the larger breadth of Earth. They are evidence of our time embedded within cycles too vast and slow for us to see. Perhaps our fragments, like ammonites, too will become symbols. Not perfect, not elegant, but echoes of beings who reached deeply into the oceans and left themselves behind. So we are left with the open question. If ammonites recorded time as spirals, what shape, what metaphor, what echo will we leave? When silence hardens over our era and oceans fold our age into permanence, will our fossils be read as wisdom, or as debris scattered carelessly in the tide? Beneath the quiet weight of water, below the level where light slowly surrenders, the chemistry of the sea is always at work, tracing pathways too fine for our eyes yet decisive enough to shape the fate of everything alive. In the Mesozoic oceans, every shell, every plankton plate, every grain of carbonate sediment carried not just its brief moment of life but also the imprint of the water it had grown in. Locked within these tiny structures were isotopes, delicate balances of oxygen and carbon, precise ratios etched during growth that would later become the whispers of forgotten climates. To study them now is to realize that the ocean itself has always kept memory, not through writing or fossil spirals, but through chemistry that endures long after the creatures themselves dissolved. Oxygen isotopes tell us of temperature. Shells formed in warm seas carry a lighter fingerprint, while those born in cooler water reveal a heavier balance. In this way, each ammonite, each coral, each microscopic coccolith became a thermometer, recording oceans as they changed from greenhouse warmth to shadowed chills. When layers of limestone or chalk are studied, scientists can trace curves in those ratios, upward in warmth, downward in cooling, rises and collapses repeating like breath. In those minute signatures we glimpse volcanic winters, greenhouse oceans, sudden disruptions when life faltered under invisible change. The record seems silent until we learn the language, and then it hums with variations, a song still resonating across millions of years. Carbon isotopes tell another kind of story, one of productivity, of abundance and scarcity. When photosynthetic plankton flourished, drawing carbon from the sea and locking it into their bodies, their isotopic ratio shifted toward distinct marks of life's exuberance. When ecosystems collapsed, it shifted again, revealing loss, imbalance, even suffocation in anoxic seas. These delicate lines, repeated in stone, carry warnings about resilience, that the ocean's balance, for all its size, is never indestructible. What appears to us as vast and unchanging is, in truth, a living chemistry, vulnerable to the smallest shifts of greenhouse gases, currents, and circulation. When geologists drill into ancient sediments and recover long cores of layered mud, they are not just extracting stone. They are drawing pages of memory, each centimeter a fragment of chemistry telling whether a year, 1,000 years, or an epic lean toward flourishing or collapse. Long before ice sheets, before any hand scribbled on parchment, the sea had already written its autobiography into oxygen ratios and carbon shifts. To run a sample across a mass spectrometer is to listen to the earliest diaries of the water itself. But what they tell us is never neat. They speak of warmth turned suddenly to cold, of rise giving way to collapse, of abundance shading into extinction. This chemistry is a memory without metaphor, but strangely it leads us back to metaphor anyway. The ratios fluctuate like heartbeat, stuttering at times, steady at others. The line between balance and unbalance was fine. Just a fraction of a degree, just the slightest tilt in chemistry, just enough to silence reefs or dissolve shells. Humbling to realize that the seas that carried reptiles of unimaginable size, seas that stretched across continents, could fall apart so suddenly because of imperceptible imbalances. The ocean was always delicate, always more fragile than its vastness suggested, always recording its own unease in isotopes that we are only now able to decode. Perhaps what is most haunting is that these chemical diaries of seas are still with us. Every glass of water, every breath pulled from the air, carries atoms recycled from those ancient oceans. The isotopic whispers of vanished seas flow through us unknown, not as fossils we can hold, but as patterns shaping the fabric of our existence. What if memory is not only in stone but also in circulation itself? Could it be that the ocean remembers not through permanence but through endless motion, writing itself again and again into every form it touches? And yet, studying those ratios, cooler, warmer, saltier, hungrier, we see that whispers are fragile. A single volcanic surge could shift them. A single disruption in circulation could drive seas into silence. Memory in chemistry is enduring, but it is not invulnerable. Carries traces, not completeness. Carries echoes, not voices. Still, from those echoes, entire histories emerge. Entire climates, entire epochs, entire extinctions, all revealed in the fine differences between two kinds of oxygen, two versions of carbon bound into shells too small for us to notice until long after the oceans that shaped them were gone. And so we are left with a quiet truth. The sea has always remembered, but it remembers in subtleties, carrying history not as stories but as particles, not as voices but as ratios. To listen is to admit patience, to admit humility, to let chemistry become language. And if such fragile imprints were enough to survive through extinctions and rebirth, then what else might the oceans still be whispering in the forgotten depths, waiting for us to learn how to read their silence? Entropy is often spoken of as loss, as the quiet disassembly of form, but in the sea it feels more like dispersal, an endless scattering that carries memory outward. The Mesozoic oceans, like the oceans of today, were shaped as much by this drift as by any act of creation. Skeletons did not remain whole for long. Shells cracked, bones separated, particles surrendered to the pull of currents. Silence deepened not because nothing remained, but because everything was spread thin, stretched across space and time until it seemed to vanish. Yet within that scattering, new shapes were always forming. Clouds of plankton, drifting mats of algae, schools of fish emergent from chaos. The sea taught its creatures, and now teaches us, that entropy and order are not opposites. They are companions, endlessly weaving through one another like currents in deep water. In those ancient seas, a predator's death was only the beginning of dispersal. Flesh dissolved into scavenger trails. Bones tumbled down slopes into darker basins. Calcium returned slowly into sediments, where it would one day crystallize into chalk. Even turbulence, what appeared to be mindless agitation, became part of a cycle. Wave energy breaking coral to rubble, rubble feeding sand, sand layering into future stone. Entropy here was not failure but transformation, not an end but another method of continuation. To lose cohesion was also to share, to pass fragments into new currents where they seeded the unfamiliar. Currents themselves are perhaps entropy's most eloquent expression. They take no single form, yet they shape all forms. They scatter larvae across basins, carry nutrients upward from abyss to surface, shift warmth and salt in endlessly repeating patterns. Currents refuse stillness. They unravel everything and, in return, they nurture everything. Even now, modern gyres collect fragments, plastic, plankton, fish alike, revealing how closely dispersal and order live together. Could it be that entropy is not destruction but a deeper intelligence, a way of ensuring nothing remains too rigid for too long? Paleontology teaches us that entire reefs collapsed when entropy outpaced growth. Coral rubble piled faster than living polyps could rebuild. And yet, in the churn of ruin, new life took root in spaces left behind. Mussels anchored to rubble, fish sought shelter in broken frameworks. Other corals rose again when waters shifted back to balance. The Mesozoic seas knew this rhythm intimately. What falls apart does not fade entirely. It drifts, it widens, it recurs. Perhaps this is why extinction pulses, though devastating, often cleared the stage for new flourishing. Without dissolution, no rebirth could emerge. Without scattering, no reunion could find shape. And what of memory? Does dispersal erase it? Or does it spread memory so thin we mistake it for absence? Traces of oxygen isotopes float into new layers, rearranged yet still present. Fossils fracture but retain patterns, their fragments still testifying to vanished forms. The ocean's entropy is not silence, it is diffusion. What once was singular becomes collective, no longer one voice but a choir of softened echoes. And if we listen closely, we might hear that entropy is not the opposite of order at all, but its quiet partner, teaching us that even in scattering there is coherence, Even in loss there is continuity. Perhaps this is why the sea feels so calming when we gaze upon it. Its surface looks chaotic, each wave dispersing against the next, and yet when seen from afar, there is rhythm, an emergent order born of disorder. Entropy rules the ocean, yes, but it rules gently, reminding us that release can be as meaningful as possession, that surrender can carry us further than grasping. The ocean disperses every life into currents, but from those dispersals, new patterns of life always bloom. And so, Entropy in Blue teaches us one lingering truth. Nothing in the sea is ever entirely lost. It drifts, it changes, it reforms in ways we may never witness but which remain part of the larger flow. And if even silence grows louder in scattering, then perhaps silence itself is not an end but another kind of current. Which leads us to wonder, if dispersal always creates new beginnings, what calendars of patience are written quietly into the sediments beneath us, forming not from permanence, but from the slow scattering of time's own fragments. Every layer of the ocean floor is a page in a calendar written in silence. Unlike our hurried notations of time, numbers carved into days, months, and years, sediments measure in patience, in grains, in accumulations too small for any eye to witness as they fall. In the Mesozoic, particles drifted constantly downward, plankton shells, fine dust carried by winds, fragments of reefs worn to sand, each descending weightless through the water, descending into darkness. Over millions of years these delicate gifts stacked one upon another, translated by pressure into rock, pages bound into cliffs that rise today like books waiting to be read. Sediments, in their slow patience, record time more comprehensively than memory ever could. To sit with them is to sit with an ocean's diary, its entries fragile yet indelible. Cretaceous chalk cliffs show us this diary in raw grandeur. Those luminous white walls, stretching across coastlines of England and France, are not blank but densely inscribed with the remains of coccolithophores, microscopic plankton that once bloomed in uncountable numbers. Each carried calcium plates arranged like petals, and when their lives ended, the plates snowed gently down, joining the vast quiet drift to the seafloor. There, amid still waters, accumulation wrote itself grain by grain into layers meters thick. What to us appears as monolithic cliff face is, in truth, endless fog preserved, a sedimented morning mist that rolled across Cretaceous oceans and hardened into permanence. It is almost inconceivable. Landscapes shaped from organisms too small to see, an empire of white raised from quietly falling dust. Shales tell the same story more darkly. In the Mesozoic's anoxic basins, fine particles of silt settled in layers so undisturbed they could cradle delicate fossils. The outline of a fish fin, the fragile wing cases of insects fallen onto water, whole schools of marine animals locked mid-motion. There is intimacy in these sediments, as if each page was written in the breath of a single moment. Shale is time pressed flat, whispers compressed until they became visible again. Every thin slice reveals a scene so ordinary, yet made extraordinary by survival. Sandstones, in contrast, mark the more restless side of the ocean's calendar. Rivers carried their fragments into the sea, waves reworked them across shallows, tides shuffled their grains into bars and dunes. Each layer is a tide's impression, a current's note, a storm's sudden bold handwriting. Entropy here is visible as record, dispersal transformed into textures we can touch with our hands. The dunes frozen in cross-bedded sandstone speak of ocean floors we could have walked across had we stood in those ancient shallows. What unites these sediments is not the scale of the creatures within them, but the scale of their patience. Together they form a calendar that does not track human years, but planetary rhythms, greenhouse ages and cooling pulses, blooms and extinctions and slow returns. When isotopes are extracted from these layers, we can read cycles of warmth and chill, oceans breathing with volcanism and quiet between. The sediments do not lie, though they do demand humility. For even where they write clearly, they also remind us of how much is missing, eras eroded away, layers never deposited, silences too complete to translate. The ocean's calendar does not account for gaps. It accepts them as part of the whole. Perhaps that is the lesson, too. Memory is never complete, but always enough to continue. To gaze upon a chalk cliff or hold a smooth stone of shale is to touch more than geology. It is to hold the condensation of countless lives, each too fleeting to see alone, yet monumental in their summation. Were we to measure our own lives by this scale, they would vanish instantly, lost between layers. Yet somehow, in the ocean's calendar, not even the briefest form is wasted. Time carries it, presses it, saves it. And so, when we lean into these cliffs, or imagine ourselves standing on the abyssal plains where dust is still falling grain by grain into silence, we stand inside a book whose end will never arrive. The pages are endlessly written, endlessly turned, endlessly buried and revealed. Oceans write, entropy edits, and land eventually lifts the words into air. And yet, if the sediments still build their patient calendars beneath us today, what will the layers that include our presence one day reveal? What color of stone? What fragile inclusions? What chemical signatures will mark the page of our own fleeting era upon the Earth's unfolding diary? Beneath the measured patience of sediments, where time seems to fall grain by grain in endless quiet, there were also moments when that silence was broken, moments of upheaval, when the ocean itself seemed to take a sharp, violent breath. Ancient storms, cyclones of staggering force, moved across Mesozoic seas much as they do today, yet they carved their power on a playing field even larger, wider, and stranger than our present world. We seldom think of storms as shapers of evolution, but in the hidden history of oceans, unrest has always played an equal role to calm. Reefs were torn and scattered, coastlines reworked, fragile creatures unmoored from their shelters. Yet when the waters stilled again, it was often in the wake of such turbulence that life found new paths, forced to adapt, to disperse, to reinvent itself in silence after chaos. For storms are not only noise, they are sculptors. A cyclone that uproots coral may also expose new stretches of seabed for colonization. A surge that scatters fish schools may separate populations into isolation, giving birth to divergences that echo through generations. Even sediment shaken by tempests becomes resorted, turned into new structures that later host entire ecosystems. In this sense, every storm is a paradox. Destruction coupled with generosity, silence interrupted so that new voices may emerge. Could it be that the balance of ocean memory depends not solely on stillness, but on the recurring punctuation of storms that remind life to move, to change, to begin again? In rock layers, we can still glimpse their signatures. Abrupt beds of coarse debris lie sandwiched within finer layers, sudden deposits marking where waves reached further than they should have, where tempest energy surged downward through reefs and shelves. Broken coral fragments cemented together in fossil reefs tell of moments when calm architects were torn apart and reassembled by force. Even within shale, where still waters usually ruled, we sometimes find turbidites, chaotic deposits formed by undersea avalanches triggered by storm-swollen waves above. These are the fingerprints of vanished weather, reminders that even when skies grow calm today, deep time carries memory of tempests past, shadows of storms still written in stone. But to drift deeper into thought is to recognize that storms themselves are entwined with silence. Turmoil always ends. The ocean always returns to calm. And in that calm, survivors adapt to a world slightly altered, while silence deepens in remembrance of what was lost. Perhaps this interplay is essential, as though the sea cannot truly hold silence without the measure of storm, and storms cannot fully shape life without the canvas of quiet to follow them. Destruction and stillness, disorder and order, always looping within one another. There is humility in knowing that what we call devastation the ocean may simply call rhythm. Storms pass, but evolution remains. Silence reigns again, but in silence, seeds of the next turbulence gather in warmth, in chemistry, in air. The Mesozoic seas were not immune to this dance. Vast cyclones swept across shallow epicontinental seas, toppling reefs that had stood for millennia, only to leave rubble grounds teeming with opportunity. In their chaotic churn, new life was flung far, scattered like messages in bottles adrift on shifting currents. Out of that scattering, new branches of lineage unfurled, new experimentations in form and survival. To imagine yourself within one of those ancient tempests is to feel both fear and awe. Waters rising like walls, reefs splintering to sand, giant reptiles struggling amidst towering waves. Yet in the long measure of deep time, the chaos melts into pattern, folded back into the ocean's diary. The storm is not remembered as destruction alone, but as a vital force of change, shaping silence just as silence shaped the storm. And so we are left with a reminder that the sea, though vast and calm when we look upon its surface, is also restless in ways that carve history as profoundly as stillness does. Every silence in the ocean carries the shape of a storm, and every storm leaves behind the resonance of silence. One cannot exist without the other. Perhaps this is the memory the seas have always carried, not a record of peace or chaos separately, but the inseparability of the two. And yet, if even storms, violent as they are, become patterns folded into memory, what of subtler lights in the water? Those strange sparks of bioluminescence, ancient and enduring, flickering as though the oceans themselves were dreaming? At night, when the sun withdraws and the upper waters fall into shadow, the ocean reveals its oldest secret, light born not from the sky, but from within. We think of bioluminescence as a wonder of the modern sea. Waves glowing blue when disturbed, drifting jellyfish sparking like fragile lanterns. But this radiance is far older than us, older even than the dinosaurs who breathed the same Mesozoic air. In those ancient oceans, long before our species could imagine light at all, darkness was already alive with sparks. Microscopic plankton shimmered in blue-green pulses when disturbed, shoals of fish carried glowing organs in patterned lines, and jellyfish lit the currents like drifting constellations. To imagine the night oceans of the Mesozoic is to imagine a sky turned upside down. Galaxies of light not above, but flowing silently beneath the surface. Bioluminescence is chemistry turned into language. Within tiny cells, molecules react, releasing photons where no sun arrives. The light is fragile yet efficient, produced without heat, without waste, in a way our technology still struggles to replicate. Some creatures used it to lure prey, others to hide themselves by matching faint starlight from above, disguising their shadows against predators circling below. Still others pulsed their lights as signals, exchanging patterns like whispers across the black. The ocean's oldest code was not sound, nor sight, but flickers of fire woven into water. Could it be that light has always been the ocean's memory, glowing softly not to dazzle but to endure? These glowing lives survived mass extinctions, reshaped oceans, and the endless chemistry of change. Ammonites vanished, reefs collapsed, predators rose and disappeared. Yet the fragile glow of plankton and jellyfish endured, carried like a torch across millions of years. To see bioluminescence today is to receive a living inheritance unbroken since the Mesozoic nights. When we stand on a beach and watch waves burn faintly blue with the touch of our step, we are not watching something new. We are looking at ancient lanterns, their chemistry unchanged, flickering through lost millennia to remind us that light is not merely warmth. It can be memory held within cells. Geology does not preserve this light. No fossil records its shimmer. No stone wall captures the glow. Here, silence in the archive becomes most profound. We know of Mesozoic bioluminescence not from shells or isotopes, but because its carriers remain among us. Jellyfish with delicate bells, deep-sea fish with lanterns on their heads, plankton adrift like living dust motes. These survivors speak for the unseen glow of ancient seas. Their existence tells us that entire oceans once glimmered in night currents, galaxies turning gently in silence, unrecorded but unforgettable in the logic of life that insisted on keeping the glow. And yet, think of the metaphor their persistence offers us. While bones and shells hardened into permanence, the light could not fossilize. It was too temporary, too elusive, too fragile to survive in rock. But it survived instead through continuity, through life. Is that not a more remarkable kind of memory? A lineage of glow, passed from cell to cell, from age to age, until it arrived here, still flickering in our waters. Perhaps fossils are the ocean's script, but bioluminescence is its voice. Soft, dim, fragile, but enduring in spirit rather than in matter. To imagine drifting in the Mesozoic night, suspended amidst glowing plankton clouds and rimlet predators, is to understand the ocean as both abyss and cosmos. Silence above, sparks below, the boundary between sea and sky dissolving into a continuous field of light. Could it be that the ocean, in glowing silently within itself, mirrors the stars above not by accident, but by necessity? That the memory of light belongs equally to both abyss and firmament? There is something deeply moving in knowing that such sparks remain. We, who measure light in speed and electricity, still marvel at the simple radiance of plankton waves along our shores. Their glow belongs not to us, but to the memory of darkness pierced, over and over, by persistence. Light and silence, woven into the deepest rhythms of the sea, remain untouched by our forgetting. And so, as reefs were scattered by storms and predators rose only to vanish, the glow endured, not fossilized, not written in stone, but carried as living flame. Perhaps that is why encountering bioluminescence feels like brushing against eternity. It is not meant to last in any one moment, but to return again and again across vast oceans of time. The Mesozoic seas drift away from us now, but their lights still linger. And yet, if such fragile sparks could survive unbroken across extinctions and deep time, what of the giants who carried themselves with an entirely different kind of presence? Massive bodies in currents, reminders that the ocean once held forms even light could not soften? The delicate lanterns of bioluminescence mark one kind of presence in the sea. Fleeting, shimmering, fragile. Yet alongside these faint sparks, the Mesozoic oceans carried another, opposite form of memory. Bodies so immense, so sculptural, that their very existence reshaped what the ocean could be. These were the giants of the currents, creatures that lived not in brief flashes of light but in sheer magnitude. Plesiosaurs with their impossibly elongated necks, ichthyosaurs with their streamlined speed, predators and diverse built for expanses of sea that dwarfed human comprehension. To drift back into their time is to enter a waterworld where size itself became a kind of language, where form was stretched and reimagined in pursuit of survival and mastery. The ichthyosaurs were perhaps the most striking proof that life repeats patterns. Resembling dolphins in outline, with torpedo bodies, crescent tails, and immense eyes adapted for hunting in dim depths, they were not mammals, not even close. They were reptiles returning fully to the sea, and yet converging by necessity upon shapes that efficiency demanded. Their bodies were not accidents. They were perfected instruments of speed carved by pressure, hunger, and current. They rose from smaller ancestors soon after the Permian extinction and flourished for millions of years as if they had always belonged to the water. In their diamond-shaped flippers, their narrow snouts lined with teeth, we glimpse a design meant for motion without rest, for presence in vast pelagic domains where only ceaseless pursuit ensured survival. Plesiosaurs, on the other hand, seemed to defy every rule of design. Some, like Elasmosaurus, carried necks longer than their entire bodies. Others, broader and shorter, were shaped more like sea turtles, with limbs transformed into immense paddles to glide elegantly through the shallows. Their anatomy baffles us even now. How did such a long neck move through water without resistance? How did they balance themselves in motion? How did they hunt? Fossils suggest that evolution itself experimented boldly, sculpting forms that seem closer to myth than biology. And yet, these creatures thrived for over 100 million years, proof that even anatomy that astonishes us still found belonging within the calm and turbulence of Mesozoic seas. To imagine encountering these giants in their own world is to imagine feeling small, even diminished, in the face of the ocean's creativity. Ichthyosaurs slicing through swarms of fish, plesiosaurs gliding silently above reefs, mosasaurs rising in shadow below them. An entire cast of giants, each built uniquely but equally fluent in the water's demands. Fossils strewn across continents remind us this was no isolated phenomenon. Their bones appear in deserts, in cliffs of shale, in quarries lifted high above present seas. Giants who once defined oceans became layers of stone that now form mountains. Could it be that even the impossibly large, once rulers of the waves, are destined to leave no trace but echoes hidden in landscapes far removed from water? Their absence today feels strange. Whales came later, filling oceans anew with vast bodies. But there is no direct line between them and Jurassic ichthyosaurs or Cretaceous plesiosaurs. These giants left no descendants. Entire lineages disappeared at the edge of epochs, as if their bodies were experiments meant to vanish once their moment passed. And yet they continue to shape how we imagine the sea. In books, in films, in the quiet awe of museums, they linger as archetypes of marine identity. Elegance, speed, enormity, mystery. They never swam alongside whales or sharks as we know them today, but their memory seems inseparable from the idea of the ocean itself. Fossils show us fragments of their story, bones rearranged by entropy into elegant skeletons posed under lights. The curvature of an ichthyosaur's ribs, the endless chain of a plesiosaur's vertebrae. Each fossil whispers that scale was once more fluid, more experimental, than we often assume. We think of whales as unique because they claim enormity, but they are part of a longer memory. The sea has carried giants before and may carry them again. If evolution permitted such bodies once, then why not again in some distant epoch beyond us? And so, these vanished shapes remind us that identity in oceans is not fixed. Giants come and pass, their absence as much a presence as their reigns once were. Whales inherit oceans not because they are descended from ichthyosaurs, but because giants are part of the ocean's rhythm, arising again and again like a chorus repeating themes across ages. Perhaps the memory carried by these fossils is that size itself is impermanent, yet the imagination of vastness is eternal. Every age finds its own form to embody enormity. Every extinction refashions the role. Every silence prepares another arrival. Standing before an ichthyosaur skull, you may feel not distance but recognition. Recognition that oceans demand reinvention, that bodies are only temporary answers to timeless currents. And in that recognition, we see that the giants did not vanish entirely. They remain in imagination, in story, in the very way we think of water as both cradle and abyss. Perhaps to be a giant in the ocean is not to last forever, but to shape the memory of the sea so deeply that life after you cannot escape your legacy. And yet, if even these impossible bodies, vast and confident, could vanish to silence, what of the smallest bodies, the plankton and microscopic rains, whose patient snowfall built empires of stone beneath their unnoticed persistence? Long after the great bodies of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs had cut their paths through the seas, another, quieter process unfolded far below them. So gentle it went unnoticed, so constant it was almost eternal. Microscopic organisms, coccolithophores and plankton no larger than dust, carried within their brief lives a secret. Shells of calcium carbonate, delicate plates like patterned shields encasing cells. When their lives ended, these shells drifted downward, pulled not by drama but by simple gravity, joining an infinite cascade. Day after day, age after age, the ocean filled itself with this snowfall, a rain of calcite more patient than any storm, more enduring than any empire. For millions of years it fell, until silence pressed it into stone, until entire cliffs emerged from accumulated fragility. To stand before the chalk cliffs of southern England or northern France is to look, unknowingly, into a vast archive of these invisible lives. Each glowing face of white that now meets the sea was once a deep ocean floor, receiving the endless sediment of coccolith shells descending in quiet certainty. Billions became trillions, falling and layering until their softness turned to stratum under pressure. Today, those cliffs are thick with memory. Not of giants, not of predators, not even of reefs, but of microcosms too small for eyes to notice, layered into permanence by patience alone. Geological memory is democratic in this way. The smallest lives can leave the greatest signatures, if only their persistence continues long enough. There is something humbling in this inversion of scale. The giants vanished, their massive skeletons rare when compared with the white expanse of coccolith accumulation. The tiny outlasted the enormous, not in individual endurance, but in numbers, in repetition, in collective persistence. A single coccolithophore was nothing. A billion upon billions created landscapes. Perhaps this is one of the sea's oldest lessons, that significance is not determined by size or power, but by constancy, by willingness to fall in silence, to gather without need of recognition, to leave behind layer after patient layer until the world remembers. The fall of these shells was not random, but rhythmic. Seasonal blooms swelled with light, filling upper waters with countless cells, and when they sank, they carried with them carbon drawn from the atmosphere. In this way, they became more than memory. They became regulators. Their rain influenced climate, balanced chemical cycles, helped stabilize oceans that were always on the edge of shift. Each descent was a quiet negotiation, each layer a conversation between life and earth, written in carbonate. Could it be that the planet itself breathes with these rains, exhaling through chalk, inhaling through dissolution, storing memory in cycles invisible to any single life? Even the texture of chalk speaks this truth. Soft, powdery, it crumbles easily, masking the permanence it represents. Yet inside it are plates still visible under magnification, exquisite designs that remain unchanged across the stretch of deep time. They are like tiny etchings on the pages of the ocean's diary, legible even after entire civilizations of life collapsed. Pressing a fragment of chalk between fingers is, in a way, placing your touch upon fossilized weather, fossilized breath, fossilized snow, compressed into stone so familiar it once wrote our alphabets and filled our classrooms as slate. The ocean, in silence, turned microscopic mortality into the very tools of our language. But even here, entropy plays its part. Rainfall of calcite can be disrupted. Periods of warming, of acidification, of chemical imbalance, slowed or halted the snow, leaving gaps in the record where silence wrote instead of shells. Sediment cores pulled from deep ocean floors reveal these gaps as darker bands, interruptions in what was otherwise steady and unbroken. They remind us that even the most constant memory is vulnerable, that even eternal snow can melt away under storms the eye cannot see. Memory is delicate, but it persists in cycles, resuming where it was interrupted, layering again in ceaseless repetition, filling the abyss with patience. And so, looking at those cliffs that shine brightest in morning fog, it is possible to sense that we are not only looking at stone but at the condensation of countless forgotten lives. Lives that once marked sunlight on the ocean, only to fall gently into dark. They remind us that permanence is not always loud, nor great, nor vast. Permanence can be built from dust, from drift, from what seems too small to matter. And yet, if even the faintest shells could transform into mountains of chalk, what then of the greater reefs that collapsed and returned, each with their own rhythm of creation and silence, empires far larger but no less fragile than this endless rain. Reefs are cathedrals built from patience, the gradual weaving of calcium skeletons by tiny polyps, multiplied across centuries, raised toward light as living fortresses. Yet, in the long stretch of the Mesozoic seas, these cathedrals were not eternal. At intervals they failed, undone not by predators or storms, but by the chemistry of the water itself. Oceans warmed, circulation faltered, volcanic pulses thickened the atmosphere with carbon, and acidity quietly spread. Skeletons dissolved grain by grain, limestone gardens reduced to rubble fields. It was not sudden collapse but the drawn-out unraveling of architectures too delicate to resist imbalance. What vanished beneath chemical change was not only form, but resonance. The uncountable hum of reef colonies silenced, their conversations with currents lost forever. To imagine the collapse of a reef is to imagine silence arriving slowly. Color leaches from the corals first as symbiotic algae flee their hosts. Creatures dependent on shelter retreat or perish. Structures weaken, shatter, fall. The sea continues to move above, currents streaming as if nothing has changed. Yet below the hush grows heavier. Diversity, once cacophonous in motion and sound, dwindles to vacancy. Whole coral provinces, built across epochs, became hushed deserts. Geological layers reveal them now as sudden transitions, vibrant carbonate deposits replaced by thinner, darker sediment, barren bands written into the ocean's diary. Acidification played the role of erasure in this process. When volcanic outpourings injected the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, the oceans absorbed it in kind. Carbonic acid spread through shallow seas, making it difficult for corals and shellfish to build their calcium carbonate homes. Reefs dissolved not in confrontation, but in retreat. The ocean became a solvent, reclaiming the very frames of its empires. And from this perspective, silence is not simple absence but chemistry refusing continuation. A reminder that memory written in calcium is fragile, forever at the mercy of the water's mood. After collapse, survivors scattered. Fish found little shelter. Invertebrates lost their latticework of protection. Some species dwindled into extinction, others retreated into niches far less grand. And yet, in the long arc of deep time, these silences were never permanent. When chemistry calmed, when acidity eased, reefs bloomed once more. New architects arose, rudest clams building mounded structures, or corals adapting to altered seas. With each return came difference, new forms, new balances, new communities. Silence, here too, became precursor, the pause before a new chorus could begin. Still, we must not blur the sorrow of loss in the comfort of return. Each reef collapse carried away entire lineages, intricate ecologies that would never repeat in the same form again. A polyp skeleton does not speak once it has crumbled. A vanished reef does not revive exactly as it was. The memory of its hum lingers only in stone, in isotopes, in rubble layered for geologists to rediscover millions of years later. To us, they become symbols of impermanence. To the ocean, they are intervals in breathing. The silence after collapse is its own kind of presence. Imagine drifting above a ruined reef field during the shadowed Mesozoic. Coral bones collapsed into dust, fish absent, octopuses wandering ruins where once life teemed in tangled diversity. The absence itself speaks, a testimony to vulnerability, to the fragile chemistry that holds together systems vast as continents yet delicate as glass. Perhaps the truest warning left for us is not in the grandeur of reefs when alive, but in the silence that followed their unraveling. And so the cycle repeated. Cathedrals raised patiently, cathedrals dissolved without sound. Over and over across the Mesozoic ages, reefs proved both resilience and fragility. They remind us that even structures made of stone depend on balances invisible to the eye, balances that can tip and tumble without noise, balances upon which silence waits patiently. And yet, if the ocean could erase even its brightest empires silently, what then of the currents themselves, the hidden circulations that carried both silence and renewal, endlessly looping as the unseen archivists of the sea? Beneath the surface, beyond reefs that rose and fell, another force was at work, one less visible but more enduring, one that shaped not just life but memory itself. The currents of the Mesozoic oceans flowed in vast and patient circuits, rising and falling, looping endlessly through basins the size of continents. These circulations moved warmth and salt, carried nutrients from abyss to shore, scattered larvae across coasts, and buried remains in deep, still plains. In doing so, they preserved more than life. They preserved memory, quietly archiving time itself in layers that built upon each other until they became pages of stone. Currents were not passive streams. They were archivists, custodians of what the sea chose to keep. In their turning, we find echoes of the Gulf Stream, of equatorial flows, of cold upwellings rising like whispers from below. Every loop carried something away and gave something back. Surface currents, charged by wind and sun, danced constantly, scattering sediments and lives. Deep currents, heavy with cold, traveled slowly through trenches and valleys, pulling dissolved oxygen and nutrients into the shadows. Together, they created a circulation of presence and absence, dispersing everything yet losing nothing, arranging particles and memories into the layered archive of the seabed. Sediment cores pulled from today's oceans reveal this story. Layer after layer shows traces of what was once carried. Dust blown from deserts, ash from volcanoes, shells of plankton that lived only briefly beneath sunlight and fell into eternity below. In the Mesozoic's greenhouse seas, these archives grew even richer, recording warmth in light isotopes, productivity in carbon signatures, sudden silences in barren layers. To read them now is to realize the ocean never forgot, no matter how much it changed. It placed memory in cycles, in loops of water and deposits, storing it not in one place but everywhere the currents wandered. And perhaps this is what makes ocean memory different from ours. We remember linearly, one thought followed by another, fragile and brief. The ocean remembers cyclically, distributing its recollections until none are lost, yet all are transformed. A creature that died in a shallow sea might fragment across hundreds of miles as currents dispersed its remains. One portion becomes part of a reef's rubble, one dissolves into the water column, another sinks, buried in deep mud. Each piece is scattered, but each becomes memory. To the ocean, dispersal is preservation. In scattering, wholeness is ensured. Could it be that this is the truest archive, the one that refuses singularity and embraces diffusion instead? Currents shape even extinction's silence into continuity. When reefs collapsed, fragments were carried to calmer waters, reshaped into limestone, buried but retained. When plankton blooms faltered, the record did not vanish. Their sudden absence stood out in sedimentary calendars as a pause, a skipped line in the otherwise steady diary of snowfall. In this way, nothing was truly forgotten. The ocean turned even collapses into punctuation marks, commas and ellipses within its own endless narrative. To imagine standing within these ancient currents is to imagine being surrounded by constant movement too slow to perceive in a single moment. A fleck of dust could circle the world over centuries. A cold mass of water could take 1,000 years to complete its loop before resurfacing. These were not movements meant for individual lives. They were movements of the planet itself, structuring memory in measures so large they feel closer to eternity. And what is remarkable is that the same circulation continues today. Just as it was in the Mesozoic, the ocean's global conveyor belt rises, falls, turns, carries, buries. Through it, our present moment is already inscribed into motion that will one day form stone. Currents do not stop. They carry us with the same inevitability they carried ammonites, ichthyosaurs, plankton, and reefs. Their work is silent, uncelebrated, but in that silence is the certainty that no era escapes the archive. In this way, currents remind us that memory need not be linear, finite, or intact. It can be scattered, dispersed, fragmented, and still endure as totality. The ocean teaches that wholeness can emerge from pieces, that time can recur, that every silence folds into another cycle of remembrance. And yet, if even currents can carry memory endlessly forward, looping through millennia without pause, what of the darker moments when the very breath of the oceans failed, when seas turned anoxic and death spread outward in waves of sulfur? What do those black tides remember? There were moments in the long story of the Mesozoic seas when the very breath of the ocean seemed to collapse inward, when circulation faltered and water turned heavy with gases no creature could endure. These were the anoxic tides, when oxygen all but vanished from great stretches of sea, and in its absence, other chemistries arose: sulfur, methane, hydrogen sulfide. Invisible but lethal, they crept outward from the depths like shadows, suffocating fish, silencing reefs, ending entire communities without sound. Extinctions are often imagined as singular catastrophes, but here, the catastrophe was invisible. An atmosphere beneath the waves thickened into poison, leaving the ocean as silent as stone. Geological cores reveal these moments clearly. Dark bands of shale, rich not in life but in the residue of decay, mark the intervals when seas drown themselves in anoxia. The absence of benthic creatures, the lack of burrows and shells in sediments, the chemical tracers of sulfur isotopes, all tell us that oceans became unbreathable. This was not noise, not storm or impact, not predators rising above prey. This was chemistry withdrawing permission. Oxygen, the pulse of life, slipped, and in its place came the stench of sulfur, a breathless stillness that claimed whole epochs. Could there be anything more silent than death by absence of air in a world of water? And yet, even these shadowed intervals did not remain pure emptiness. Where oxygen could not exist, other life found purchase. Bacterial mats thickened, thriving on sulfur, dyeing waters with strange blooms. Methanogens stirred in sediments, releasing gases that eventually leaked upward, sometimes into the atmosphere, thickening climate chaos above. Death became fuel, and extinction itself became the seam upon which the next beginning rested. Perhaps this is the paradox at the heart of deep time. that even the breath of death carries within it the seeds of renewal. In these anoxic seas, we glimpse the fragility of balance. A small warming, a brief stagnation in circulation, a volcanic flood unleashing too much carbon. It did not take much to tip the sea into silence. For us, with our brief measures of time, it is hard to comprehend how easily oceans that once stretched with life could shift into deserts of breathless water. But chemistry is merciless in patience, and the ocean has no loyalty to continuity. Where oxygen cannot be held, life must adapt or vanish. Extinction here feels inevitable, not because the ocean willed it, but because chemistry set the terms and life was given too little room to breathe within them. Still, the silence that followed was not absolute. After death, opportunity returned. When anoxia receded, when waters circulated again, when oxygen returned like slow dawn into abyssal plains, entirely new communities emerged. Survivors thrived in niches vacated. Plankton radiated into fresh diversity. Reefs tried new architects, some clams, some corals, each one remaking what collapse had undone. If we peer through the lens of geology, the rhythm is almost steady. Suffocation, silence, then renewal. Not because endings are soft, but because endings never hold the canvas forever. Perhaps it is this pattern that unsettles us most. Extinction by impact stuns us with violence, yet extinction by chemistry unnerves us more deeply, because it whispers, because it shows how easy it is to erase vast thriving systems without flame, without sound, without visible rupture. It reminds us that memory itself can suffocate, that oceans can forget whole branches of life just by refusing them oxygen. And yet, in this forgetting also lingers transformation. For never once did the ocean's death breath last forever. Always, circulation returned. Always, oxygen spread again. Always, silence gave way to sound. To walk alongside cliffs of black shale today is to inhale faint echoes of that suffocation. To recognize in their color the accumulation of lives ended abruptly. But to see the life upon those cliffs, plants growing, birds circling, is to also recognize the truth that even suffocation is temporary, that every ending remains open to return. Entropy rules, yet order always finds its way back. Could it be, then, that sulfur and silence were as vital to Earth's narrative as coral light and predator shadows? That without the breath of death, rebirth could not have found its canvas at all? And so the Mesozoic seas speak through paradox. That extinction is real, that silence can weigh heavier than stone, and yet that silence itself becomes medium for renewal. Dark tides ended epochs, yes, but without them, the later daughters of the ocean, new reefs, new fish, new radiances of life, would never have come. And yet, if even oceans could be suffocated into silence and then coaxed back into breath, what other memories live among us now in the survivors of those ages? Living fossils who still carry the pulse of Mesozoic waters into the present day. As epochs rose and fell, as reefs collapsed and predators vanished, as anoxic tides silenced entire seas, not everything was lost. Some lives, against the odds, endured. They carried their forms through the upheavals of extinction, through cycles of warming and chill, through the collapse and rebirth of ocean systems. To find them today is to glimpse continuity stretching backward into the Mesozoic and beyond. They are often called living fossils, though the phrase is more poetry than taxonomy. Coelacanth, horseshoe crabs, chambered nautiluses, creatures older than the dinosaurs, yet still here, inhabiting the overlooked corridors of our planet. Their presence is less about survival in the strongest sense and more about the mystery of endurance. How certain shapes, once imagined by evolution, seem so perfectly tuned that they needed little alteration for hundreds of millions of years. Take the coelacanth. For decades, it was believed to be gone, another name on the long list of vanished lineages. Only through fossil imprints did we know of its lobed fins, fins that looked enough like protolimbs to remind us of our own deep ancestry. Then, in 1938, one appeared again in the nets of a South African fisherman. Its blue scales glowing with metallic sheen, alive and breathing after 65 million years of assumed absence. Holding in its body the memory of ancient seas, the coelacanth is not simply a survivor. It is a reminder that deep time is never fully closed, that ocean memory still pulses in caves and canyons where our lights rarely reach. The horseshoe crab tells another story, one even more enduring. Its armor-plated form, domed shell, and spine tail has slipped across more than 400 million years, into and out of extinction events, with hardly a gesture of change. These creatures have watched reefs rise and fall, predators evolve and disappear, climates tilt wildly, and yet their simple design remains sufficient. Even now, they gather on beaches in the light of the full moon, ancient rituals continuing as though the Mesozoic had never ended. Perhaps their secret is not strength but humility, live so well balanced with their environment that they did not break themselves against change. They endure because they do not resist the rhythm of the sea. And then the chambered nautilus, drifting slowly in spiral shells like ammonites that once filled the seas. The resemblance is haunting, the nautilus an echo still breathing while its ancient cousins vanished forever. With each chamber it builds in its coiled home, it tells the same story ammonites once wrote, that growth, memory, and balance are spiraled together. It rises and falls with gas-filled chambers, adjusting its buoyancy with patience. Like a clock without urgency, it charts the same curve through the ages. When we hold a nautilus shell in our hands, we are not holding just beauty, but continuity, one of the last long breaths of the Mesozoic, still present in our own waters. These creatures remind us that the Mesozoic did not end absolutely. It continues to breathe, quietly, in corners most of us overlook. In tide pools, in deep coastal shelves, in twilight zones where light dims but does not vanish, the survivors linger. Their bodies are not mere antiquities but vessels of persistence. They carry with them not just their own survival, but the survival of memory. Reminders that extinction is not absolute, that some rhythms echo unbroken across collapse. Could it be that resilience itself is another kind of fossil, one written in pulse rather than stone? Geology shows us what was lost, but living fossils show us what endures alongside loss. They are the bridge across silences, proof that continuity can slip through even the darkest extinctions if it hides in the right forms, the right niches. When we gaze at a coelacanth or nautilus today, we are not only looking at an animal, we are looking at time itself woven into flesh, at persistence so complete it feels otherworldly. And so the sight of these creatures inspires both humility and wonder. They remind us that while much has collapsed, not everything has vanished. The world does not reinvent itself wholly each epoch. It tapestries rebirth with threads of ancient memory. The Mesozoic is not gone. It is with us now, breathing slowly, overlooked but undeniable. And yet, if such beings can carry the memory of entire eras forward, what of the seas themselves? The vast basins reshaped by drifting continents, the opening and closing of waters that made new pathways for life and silence alike? The quiet endurance of living fossils speaks of continuity, but beneath that stillness the very shape of the world was shifting. During the Mesozoic, continents did not remain fixed. They drifted apart, splitting slowly, irresistibly, as if the planet itself were exhaling. Oceans widened in their wake. Where once there had been enclosed seas, vast new corridors of water opened, connecting habitats, scattering life. Every shoreline fossil, every cliff that borders today's coasts, carries an echo of these separations. The ocean was not only stage, not only participant, but also recorder. Its floor taking note of each tear, each widening gulf, each new horizon of water that poured in between diverging lands. In the beginning of the era, most of Earth's land lay joined in the massive supercontinent of Pangaea. Its outlines framed a single immense ocean, Panthalassa, with a smaller sea, the Tethys, pressed within the folds of land. As tectonic forces stretched and fractured, Pangaea cracked open, and the Tethys expanded. The Atlantic began its slow unfurling, a seam of basalt widening grain by grain. To us, these seem like violent events written in charts of geology. But in the slow-motion rhythm of deep time, they were not sudden ruptures. They were drifts, imperceptible to any watching creature, yet transformative beyond imagination. Could it be that the greatest shifts are those we cannot feel at all, those whose scale is too wide for living eyes? Life, as always, followed the water's lead. Marine creatures once clustered together in single seas spread outward. New corridors carried ammonites and ichthyosaurs into novel ranges. Ocean giants wandering spaces never before available. Coral reefs grew along fresh margins. Pioneers of limestone cathedrals in basins that had only recently opened. Evolution flourished in the wake of separation, because separation brought possibility. Isolation created difference, and difference eventually blossomed into diversity. Each widening ocean was as much an experiment as it was a record, shaping the living cast of each age. Fossils capture this geography as clearly as any map. A trilobite here tells of an earlier connection now vanished. A shell found on both South American and African cliffs recalls a time before the Atlantic divided them. The symmetry of ammonite species spanning wide regions reflects the unity of seas that only later fractured. Layer by layer, distribution itself became story. To the patient eye of geology, the presence or absence of certain creatures can read like a journal entry. Here the land was united, here the ocean widened, here life adapted to a horizon stretched slightly further than before. Continental drift also rewrote climate, and with it the balance of oceans. As basins expanded, circulation grew more complex. Temperatures shifted, currents rearranged, coastlines lengthened into networks. Shallow epicontinental seas spread across interiors, creating vast spaces where plankton blooms built chalk, where reptiles evolved to rule waters far from the open abyss. Everything life became in the Mesozoic carried the imprint of this tectonic drift. Even silence was reshaped, for extinctions often came when circulation broke down, oxygen faltering in basins that continents had slowly stretched into shape. It is tempting to imagine the Earth itself as restless in these times, reshaping its face as casually as the tide rearranges sand. Mountains rose, oceans spread, ecosystems reconfigured. Yet underneath the violence of motion lay patience. The continents did not hurry. They drifted like rafts across mantle currents, so slowly that a creature could live and die without noticing the horizon had shifted at all. Only the memory of stone records what it meant. That landscapes were temporary, that seas were not fixed, that everything lived inside a geography still being written. And so, to stand upon a fossil shoreline today is to stand in two places at once. Your feet rest on stone, but the shapes preserved within them tell of vanished seas, of coasts bent elsewhere, of worlds that were drifting apart even then. The present ocean is only the latest draft, another widening horizon with its own margins waiting to be fossilized. Just as ammonites once spread across oceans we no longer name, so too do our species leave traces scattered across an earth still in motion, though too wide and slow for us to feel. The ocean witnessed these continental shifts as both a recorder and a canvas. It absorbed the separations into its sediments, transferred memory through isotopes, marked presence by shifting faunus. In widening, it created not just distance, but possibility. The true identity of the sea may not be permanence at all, but adaptability, its ability to accept every change and still remain itself. And yet, if oceans can widen and reshape without sound, what more haunting silences wait within their basins? Places where whole schools of creatures met their end, and where the stillness of bone beds speaks louder than history ever could. Across the shifting oceans and widening coasts of the Mesozoic, most death went unseen, dispersed by scavengers, scattered by currents, dissolved into sediments without trace. But sometimes, fate wrote a different kind of page. Places where life ended not in fragments, but all at once, preserved in sudden stillness. These places are called bone beds. Vast concentrations of skeletons, layer upon layer of creatures arrested mid-motion, trapped by forces greater than their bodies could withstand. To walk among them today, to lift from stone the brittle outlines of fish or reptile, is to stand at the border between frenzy and silence, between lives in motion and the stillness that claims them forever. The causes were many. Some bone beds were formed by storms, violent surges that drove schools of fish into shallows, where waters retreated and bodies stranded, piling together before burial in silt. Others came from anoxic pulses, when oxygen dropped unexpectedly and creatures suffocated together, their bodies spiraling down into hypoxic basins where scavengers could not survive to scatter them. At times, volcanic ash fell through the water, sudden and choking, layering itself over entire communities, snapping abundance into memory silenced in dust. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. A snapshot of life arrested not individually, not gradually, but collectively, as if the ocean turned one moment into eternity. Bone beds are strange in this way. They are catastrophes, yet they are also revelations. Where ordinary death disperses, here life remains gathered, layered into patterns we can still read. Whole fish shoals lie side by side, mouths open as if still swimming, fins frozen as though caught mid-turn. Ammonites cluster together in what were once drifting congregations, their shells settling into chalk that faithfully preserved their symmetry. Sometimes marine reptiles too are found in abundance, entangled across layers, evidence of sudden die-offs where entire populations collapsed at once. To us, these sites seem haunting. To geology, they are memory unusually intact, a chorus of voices stilled yet waiting to be read. And in that stillness lies a paradoxical peace. The frenzy has already ended. The struggle, the panic, the silences between breath and last movement, all of it has vanished. What remains is quiet, a quiet so deep it feels deliberate, as though the sea itself chose to fold that moment into calm. Perhaps this is why bone beds feel sacred to us when we uncover them. They are not chaos, not wreckage, but order born in silence, the memory of violence reshaped into stillness. We read frenzy through its outline, but what we feel is tranquility. In truth, bone beds are a reminder not only of catastrophe but of preservation. If not for sudden endings, we would never know entire schools or communities as they once appeared together. Storms that destroyed also secured their memory. Anoxic seas that suffocated also sheltered against scavengers. Volcanic ash that blanketed life in darkness also sealed it into stone. Catastrophe, strangely, was the hand that wrote preservation most clearly, giving us entire scenes instead of fragments. Could it be that the ocean itself required these moments of mass silence to ensure its memory survived across time? When scientists kneel by these sites, brushing gently at shale or chalk to reveal forms hidden for ages, it is as if they are listening to the sea's voice, speaking in chords rather than notes. A single fossil may tell part of a story. A bone bed tells a chorus. It is not only anatomy or chemistry that emerges, but community, presence, abundance, and loss together. In silence, frenzy becomes harmony. In stone, panic becomes patience. What we meet are not only deaths, but frozen moments of togetherness, the kind that could not otherwise have survived. Perhaps this is why bone beds stir something deeper than scientific curiosity. They remind us of mortality gathered as collective truth. They remind us that endings come not only in solitude, but sometimes all at once, in shared silence. And within that silence is the reassurance that memory is carried, no matter how abrupt, no matter how total. And yet, if even catastrophe can be preserved as quiet harmony, what greater catastrophe must it have been when a comet's dust fell into the sea, dimming skies, tilting climates, and marking the end not of one community, but of an entire age. The stillness of bone beds speaks to catastrophe paused in a moment, yet nothing in the history of the seas compares to the silence following the fall of the comet at the end of the Cretaceous. Chicxulub, it is a name that rolls like thunder even now, but in truth it was not thunder that killed the seas. It was dust. When that asteroid struck the shallow waters of the Yucatan, the world was rocked by fire, heat, and shock waves. But the greater silence came in the aftermath. Fine particles of vaporized stone, soot, and ash carried skyward into the stratosphere, then falling slowly, day upon day, into the oceans. It darkened sunlight, altered chemistry, changed the very pulse of planetary circulation. What ended the Mesozoic was not only the violence of the impact, but the long suffocation of drifting dust, diffusing into water, pressing extinction into every tide. For a time the seas burned. Tsunamis surged outward from the impact site, tearing across shallow shelves, stripping coastlines bare. Fires raged on land, their soot carried down rivers into the ocean basins. But these initial bursts of chaos faded quickly. What lingered was atmosphere transfigured. A sun dimmed into shadow, rain of acid falling from skies hostile to coral and plankton alike, cooling in some regions, suffocating warmth in others. The oceans did not collapse overnight, but they entered a long twilight where the rhythms of life faltered. Plankton, the base of the marine food web, were among the first to suffer. Without steady sunlight, their blooms stilled. In sediments, we see this interruption as ghostly bands where their calcite shells nearly vanish. No snowfall of microfossils, no foundation for new chalk, only thin lines of scarcity pressed between older, richer layers. With the plankton fell the ecosystems that depended on them: ammonites, filter-feeding fish, predators who hunted by abundance. One extinction cascaded into another, like ripples from a stone sinking into calm water, each ring spreading further and slower until the entire basin was hushed. In those seas, the great reptilian giants, the mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, the last ichthyosaurs already gone, vanished quickly. Apex predators can only stand when the base of the pyramid is strong, and when plankton dwindled, their prey disappeared, and when prey disappeared, the predator's shadows were erased from the water entirely. What we know of them now comes from scattered skeletons buried mid-collapse, their remains sealed into the very sediments their absence once carved. The ammonites, too, spirals of time that had measured millions of years without faltering, were silenced. With the comet's dust, their long lineage closed. The oceans seemed suddenly emptied of their familiar voices, rearranged almost overnight into new compositions. Dust had rewritten what extinction meant. Not gradual disappearance, but an erasure pressed fiercely from sky to sea. And yet, even here, rebirth lay quietly beneath devastation. Not all plankton vanished. A few forms endured, waiting inside silty waters for circulation to clear. Not all fish were gone. Not all corals dissolved. Tiny survivors clung almost invisibly to niches left hollow. And when the dust finally settled, when sunlight slowly returned through thinning haze, life rose again like dawn itself. But it was not the same life. It was simplified, pared down, fragile at first, yet with time these new beginnings expanded. Entire lineages absent for millions of years became opportunities for the new, fishes of modern design, corals in reshaped reefs, in time even mammals to take the paths the reptiles had abandoned. In its silence, the sea wrote another beginning. For geology, the mark of Chicxulub is sharp. Sediment cores reveal a line, a razor-thin clay boundary enriched in iridium, an element rare on Earth but common in meteorites. Above it, fossils vanish. Below it, diversity thrives. Within that narrow layer exists the memory of a single day, a day that ended the Cretaceous, a day the sea received dust from skyfall as scripture, carrying the record forward into all oceans yet to come. In that line, entropy and order coexist, silence folded into rebirth. Perhaps this is what makes the comets afterward so haunting. Land was scarred, yes, skies darkened, forests burned. But it was in the water that dust found its deepest reach, dissolving into currents, tangling with the chemistry of the seas. Memory itself became altered, entire ages folded into absence. And in the patient silence that followed, a new ocean found its first breath. And yet, if dust can erase entire lineages and seas themselves can dim into shadow, what comes after? What kind of ocean emerges in the afterimage of extinction? What rebirth stirs beneath the silence when the waters begin to move again? In the silence after the comet's dust had settled, the oceans lay scarred but not empty. Storms still circulated, currents still turned, but the voices that once filled those waters, the spiraling ammonites, the shadows of mosasaurs, the vibrant hum of Cretaceous reefs, were gone. What rose in their absence was not immediate abundance, but a tentative stillness, a hush where only fragments of life remained. The extinction had cleared the stage, and though the sea was vast, its inhabitants were few. Yet even in that desolation, patience was at work. The water itself seemed to remember how to begin again, reshaping life slowly, delicately, as if rebuilding the very script of existence from faint whispers. Plankton, fragile and innumerable, took the first steps of renewal. Though many of their forms had disappeared in the comet's shadow, a handful endured, continuing the ancient ritual of photosynthesis in the thinned light. Their drift replenished the base of the food chain, small bodies feeding small grazers feeding the patient return of predators. From such simple cycles, oceans breathed once more. The snowfall of tiny calcite shells resumed, silent but steady, beginning to weave the first new chapters into the sedimentary archives. Renewal did not roar. It whispered, grain by grain, cell by cell, patient as dawn. Fish were the next to rise into the emptied niches. Freed from competition with vanished reptiles, they multiplied in form and behavior. Lineages that had been minor before expanded into new experiments. Faster swimmers, more agile hunters, more specialized feeders. Their fossils, scattered across Paleocene strata, tell a story of quiet reinvention. The oceans did not return to what they had been. They became something new, remade by both absence and persistence. In each change, we see water's secret. Not resistance, but adaptation. Where silence falls, the sea learns to compose another song. Reefs, once ruined in chemical collapse and comet shadow, began to stir again as well. The designers were different now. Rudous clams that had dominated the Cretaceous were gone, but corals returned in patient growth. At first their structures were modest, tiny colonies grasping foothold against eroded stone. Slowly, they expanded, layer by layer, until once again warm seas glittered with living limestone architecture. These newborn reefs were not identical to the vanished cathedrals of the Mesozoic, but they carried the same intent: to build, to shelter, to sustain. Renewal, the ocean teaches, is never replication. It is invention drawn from what remains. And as the smaller lives flourished, new giants began to appear, not reptiles this time, but mammals venturing into saltwater for the first time. Their steps were cautious, their forms still more terrestrial than marine, but the path had begun. The silence left by mosasaurs and plesiosaurs would, in time, be filled by whales, dolphins, and seals. Water did not abandon the shape of largeness. It simply rewrote it, carrying the idea of giants forward into new materials, new voices, new futures. What is erased is never entirely forgotten. It waits for water to write it again in altered form. The pace was not without pauses. Climatic aftershocks rippled through the Paleocene, at times warming the seas, at other times cooling them abruptly. Ocean chemistry continued its fragile balance, shaping where new reefs could rise, where plankton could bloom, where survivors could expand. Yet the overall rhythm was one of rebound. Entropy had taken much, but the dispersal of life, the scattering of its remnants, proved enough to reassemble an ocean of new possibility. In every silence, the water wrote a return. Perhaps this is what is most humbling. The ocean does not hurry, but it does not stop. Even when emptied of its brightest forms, it learns to breathe again. Even when entire lineages vanish, new ones find pathways through its currents. The aftermath of extinction is proof not only of fragility, but of endurance. The quiet truth that water itself is the great archivist and artist of life, shaping new patterns even when loss seems too immense to replace. To imagine those reborn oceans is to imagine seas both strange and familiar. Gone were the spiraled ammonites, gone the vast reptiles. But in their place, plankton drifted as they always had. Fish swam in new forms. Reefs sparkled back to growth, and the first whispers of whales stirred. A shadowed rebirth, yes, but a rebirth nonetheless, patiently sculpted by silence. And yet, if oceans were able to renew themselves even after the collapse of an age, how much more intricate are the rhythms of heat and cold that govern them still, cycles vast enough to leave their mark in isotopes, rising and falling like the pulse of the planet itself. After extinction, when silence had eased and new life began to stir, the oceans entered another rhythm, one even slower than recovery itself. This was the rhythm of climate, the long breathing of Earth in heat and cold, in tightening ice and spreading warmth. Long after the last dinosaurs had vanished, the seas continued to carry cycles seated in the Mesozoic, patterns recorded in isotopes that reveal the planet's pulse across millions of years. The memory of those oceans remained, embedded not in fossils alone but in chemistry, oxygen ratios, carbon balances, subtle traces that tell us of climates long vanished yet never entirely lost. During the Mesozoic, the world leaned toward warmth. Greenhouse ages stretched vast inland seas across continents, seas glowing with plankton blooms and reefs growing in places where today there is desert. But within those warm epochs, fluctuations were already at work. Volcanic pulses enriched the air with carbon. Shifts in circulation cooled waters unexpectedly. These experiments in climate were recorded in every shell, every microfossil, every buried layer. Later, when the world tipped into colder rhythms, those same records told us the story, that the seeds of glacial cycles were present even then, folded quietly inside the chemistry of ancient seas. Could it be that oceans always remember extremes, even while appearing calm in the present? When geologists examine oxygen isotopes in Cretaceous chalk or Jurassic limestone, they find patterns, not random, but repeating, a quiet oscillation of sea temperatures across millennia. These were the first hints of cycles that in later ages would expand into full icehouse and greenhouse rhythms. The Mesozoic oceans bore witness to warm waters lapping near the poles, yet also to periodic cooling events that temporarily stilled coral growth and narrowed habitat ranges. What looks to us like stability across tens of millions of years is, upon closer reading, a constant negotiation between warmth and chill. These negotiations shaped life as much as catastrophic impact or extinction. A warmer sea expanded diversity in some places, yet a sudden cooling pruned ecosystems harshly. Coral reefs waxed and waned, fish distributions shifted, plankton adjusted their assemblies. Each subtle turn persisted in sediment, each temperature swing marked by isotope ratios in the thin walls of shells. These were not dramatic moments like the fall of fire from the sky, but softer dramas, written in chemistry, predictable, and yet still capable of erasing entire populations. In them, we see how the ocean does not remember only extinctions, but also every fluctuation, every breath of heat and release into cold. When the world eventually cooled into icehouse ages, long after the Mesozoic, the imprint of earlier seas remained. The oceans had already rehearsed imbalance. They had practiced warmth and endured temporary chills. They had embedded those rhythms into their chemistry. And so, in oxygen isotopes carved into tiny fossils, we find the echoes of seas that prepared for cycles even larger than themselves. It is as if the Mesozoic was a prelude, an overture in which the Earth tested its capacity for extremes, leaving a diary of fluctuations that would guide future epochs into their own climate symphonies. This memory of heat and memory of cold offers us a lens into impermanence. Life flourishes when oceans are warm, but too much warmth dissolves reefs, collapses currents. Life adapts when seas are cooler, but too much chill pushes species into retreat. Balance, the isotopes remind us, is transient, always temporary. To read them is to read not permanence but dance. Heat and cold circling one another across ages, each yielding and returning. Perhaps this is why ocean memory never holds still, because it is built from these oscillations, these restless testaments of contrast. There is something almost human in these patterns. Like breath, like pulse, they show expansion and contraction, rise and release. To view glacial and greenhouse oscillations simply as climate data is to miss their poetry. They are the rhythms of the planet's life force, written most clearly in water. Oceans hold heat, shift currents, balance energy, and then fold these adjustments into isotopes for us to discover millions of years later. The sea is both participant and recorder, both body and memory, carrying in its chemistry what it endured, what it survived, what it reshaped. And yet, if oceans carry within them cycles of warmth and chill, fragments of every climate swing ever endured, what do the reefs themselves whisper within these rhythms? Reefs that dreamed repeatedly of permanence, but were always scattered again by the patient entropy of time. Coral dreams in stone. Each polyp, no larger than a fingertip, reaches upward toward the light with skeletal patience, laying one fragile framework against another until whole cathedrals begin to form beneath the waves. In the Mesozoic, as in every age, reefs spread like living continents, their walls alive with color and sound, their chambers woven by countless patient hands too small for the eye to notice. And yet, despite this relentless dedication, despite their persistence across millions of years, reefs never escape entropy. Collapse always finds them. Storms scatter rubble. Acidity dissolves their walls. Warming currents bleach their colors into bone. It is a paradox written into their very being. Coral builds always toward permanence, yet permanence always fails. Their struggle is not against failure itself, but against the inevitability that all empires, even empires of light and limestone, must fall back into silence. Reefs embody the rhythm of entropy more clearly than almost any system in the ocean. Their architecture seems solid, immovable. Stone jungles teeming with fish, clams, crustaceans, and the endless drift of plankton. But what appears enduring is only provisional, balanced precariously on chemical thresholds. Too much carbon in the sea, and skeletons that seemed unbreakable soften. Too much warmth in the shallows, and the delicate partnership between coral and algae collapses, leaving behind skeletons pale as ghosts. Entropy does not need violence. It enforces itself subtly, through chemistry, through imbalance, through slow erosion. What polyp patience tried to build for centuries can vanish in years. And yet, coral never ceases. Again and again across the Mesozoic, after collapse had stripped whole seas of their gardens, polyps began anew, finding small footholds on rubble plains, sending skeletons upward again in dreamlike repetition. There is humility here, a lesson folded into persistence. Endurance is never absolute, but always attempted. In this sense, coral's history is less about permanence and more about devotion. Not the devotion of intent, but of process. Life repeating itself even in the face of certain collapse. Could it be that reefs, in their endless rise and ruin, are metaphors not simply of ecosystems, but of memory itself, constantly striving against erosion, constantly trying to be remade? In stone, we discover the fragments of these dreams. Fossil reef frameworks built in the Jurassic rest today in Central Europe turn to limestone mountains. Rudist reefs of the Cretaceous scatter in Mexico and the Mediterranean, their structures built not by corals at all but by clams that expanded into the role when symbiosis faltered. In each case, entropy scattered them eventually, but not before laying down archives strong enough to survive as stone. To climb a limestone escarpment or lean against chalk cliffs is to touch the hardened persistence of ancient reefs. Each block a testament to life's stubborn refusal to stop building toward light. Entropy ensures all structures fall, but it also ensures all structures give way to something new. Reefs collapse, but in their debris, others find home. Urchins burrow into the rubble. Sponges colonize the broken walls. Fish weave among fallen towers. Even ruin itself has utility, silence itself reshaped by other forms. Entropy is not antagonism, but inevitability, and it is in this inevitability that new possibility emerges. Coral teaches us this by example. That fragility is not weakness, but a form of resilience that accepts collapse as part of the cycle. Their struggle becomes metaphor for us when we look deeper. Human memory, like coral, is built in fragments, assembled carefully over time, reaching toward some permanence that entropy always threatens. We build towers of thought, archives of knowledge, architectures of culture. Yet, like reefs, we too collapse, stories eroding, voices bleaching, leaving only fragments carried forward. Still, like coral, we begin again. We tell and retell, we rebuild the cathedrals of memory, knowing they will never be permanent but enduring anyway. Coral persists not because it triumphs over entropy, but because it rises against it with every chance it is given. Perhaps this is why reefs touch us so deeply, why their ruins feel holy in cliffs and stone fields, and why their collapse stirs sorrow today. They remind us of how fragile life's resistance truly is, and yet how beautiful that resistance becomes, even in failure. The lesson of coral is not permanence, but persistence. Not endurance, but the poetry of continual return. And yet, if reefs embody repetition and collapse, dreams and entropy, what of the greater dreams we project back into the Mesozoic seas? The possibility of civilizations that existed not in air, but beneath the waters, whose traces may linger as speculation within stone. We think of civilizations as something uniquely human, temples and roads, towers stretching toward the sky, written records carved into stone. Yet when we drift back into the oceans of the Mesozoic, looking at reefs and shells and predator shadows, a speculative thought rises quietly. What if civilizations were not unique to land at all? What if entire architectures, unknowable and alien, once thrived beneath the water, never made of brick or bronze but of coral, shell and silence? When we look at reefs turned to limestone, ammonites pressed into chalk, predators memorialized in shale, perhaps what we are glimpsing are the ruins of civilizations we have no language to describe. Coral, after all, built sprawling cities. Their skeletal cathedrals rose wall upon wall, chamber upon chamber, interwoven into expanses visible even from space. Billions of tiny builders worked in communal persistence, arranging grids of shelter where fish, mollusks, and crustaceans lived in shared networks. To us, this is ecosystem, but could it also be read as city? If we alter our definitions, if we adopt the patience of the ocean in place of our own expectations, reefs begin to appear as living metropolises, planned not through intent, but by rhythm, chemistry, and light. A metropolis not bound by politics or architecture as we know it, but architecture nonetheless, dissolved now into limestone cliffs that mark the ghost outlines of worlds once intricately busy. And ammonites, what of them? Their spirals were repeated endlessly across the seas, clustered in shallow waters where currents offered opportunity. Imagine not simply creatures, but towers of spirals, communities of drifting whirls, layered into something like oceanic skylines. Each shell was a chambered structure, each spiral both home and memory. Entire schools of ammonites drifted together as if designing cities of air-filled halls moving upon currents. When fossil beds preserve them clustered so densely they resemble mosaics, might we not imagine these as remnants of an alien architecture? A civilization measured not in roads but in spiraled forms, dissolved now into chalk. Even predators could be seen, in this speculative light, as ruling empires. Mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, apex hunters patrolling domains vast as continents. Their presence shaped every decision made by smaller creatures, their movements structuring ecosystems in ways similar to how empires on land structured trade and cities. To schools of fish, a passing predator was no abstract danger but the equivalent of a sovereign shadow, shaping behavior, organizing shoals, dictating which waters remained safe corridors and which were perilous. Could it be that predator empires, invisible to stone but powerful in influence, were another architecture altogether? An empire traced not in palaces but in absence, in avoidance, in the very currents of fear that organized life across the seas? This is, of course, speculation, and perhaps more metaphor than memory. But to imagine reefs and ammonites and predators as civilizations of the sea is to open ourselves to a humbler view of our own story. We like to think we are the first to inscribe meaning into matter, yet oceans have been inscribing far longer with calcium, symmetry, and silence. What is our marble compared to reefs the size of countries? What is our architecture compared to a spiral so perfect that it applies equally to ammonites and galaxies? Civilizations may not always write in words. They may write in forms, and those forms may be dissolved, but not entirely erased. When we run our hands across limestone cliffs, when we cradle ammonites in our palms, perhaps we are touching the ruins of civilizations. Not human, not intentional, but alien nonetheless. They do not cry out their presence. They whisper. They remind us that permanence is always fragile, and that even civilizations can dissolve into sand, leaving only the faintest memory for others to rediscover. Could it be that our own cities will one day seem as alien to whoever follows us, as coral cathedrals and ammonite towers seem alien to us now? Geology suggests inevitability. Civilizations, whether human or coral, whether spiraled or squared, eventually succumb to entropy. Their architectures shift into stone, their voices into silence, their traces into fragments misunderstood or forgotten. Yet in another way, nothing is truly lost. These remnants persist in different languages. Chalk cliffs gleaming white against the sea, shale layers carrying spiraled mosaics of ammonites, predator shadows still haunting our imagination. The civilizations of the Mesozoic may have dissolved, but they continue to shape our sense of the sea, just as surely as our ruins will shape memory in times far beyond us. And so we are left with this gentle, unsettling thought. Civilizations need not be measured in bricks, nor in words, but in persistence. Persistence in coral skeletons layered into stone, in spiraled forms pressed into mountains, in predator shadows stretching across oceans that no longer exist. The Mesozoic carried them all, and though they dissolve, their memory lingers. And yet, if we can glimpse civilizations dissolved into stone, what does this suggest of the ocean itself? Not as city or ruin, but as a mirror, reflecting time back at us, reminding us of cycles we are already part of without knowing. The sea has always reflected back what is placed within it. To look into water is to see an image of ourselves returned, wavering with each ripple. Yet beneath that surface lies a far older mirror, one polished by millions of years of memory. The Mesozoic oceans, though vanished, are not entirely gone. Their forms linger in stone, their chemistry preserved in isotopes, their silence still shaping how we imagine the depths. When we study them, we are not only learning what came before, we are seeing reflections of what we are now, and what we too might one day become. Every ripple carries with it the suggestion of recurrence, that time folds rather than runs straight, that our present is already inscribed with echoes of the past. Ammonites, with their endless spirals, became clocks for geology. We read their absences as extinctions, their reappearances as renewal. Today, our oceans carry similar markers, though of a different kind. Plastic debris drifts across gyres. Microfibers settle into seafloor mud. Alloys and concrete break slowly into fragments. Just as ammonite shells once layered cliffs into chalk and limestone, our technofossils are filtering into tomorrow's strata. If time mirrors itself, then our debris, too, may one day be catalogued as fossils. Strange relics compared with shells, but no less enduring. Perhaps the reflection found in the ocean is not only of beauty, but of responsibility. The recognition that our signature is already entering the deep record. To see ourselves in the Mesozoic seas is to remember that nothing escapes recurrence. Warmth and chill, collapse and renewal, complexity and silence. Each has repeated endlessly, embedded into geology as though the earth were breathing in and out across deep time. Even extinction itself echoes, never singular but patterned, pulses of absence folding into pulses of return. And here, in our own epoch, the same rhythms rise. Oceans warming, reefs collapsing, chemical balances faltering. The mirror shows us images not separate from ourselves but of ourselves, played back across millions of years. Could it be that by looking into ancient water, we are witnessing not history but prophecy, our own reflection wandering through the ruins of past oceans? There is humility in this realization. When we gaze at ammonite spirals, we might think they belong to another world entirely. But in truth, they belong to ours, a different facet of the same ocean that still surrounds our coasts. The continuity is startling. The sea of then is the sea of now, and the reflections it offers are not abstract. They remind us that permanence is fragile, that balance is delicate, that civilizations, whether coral or human, leave behind their traces, whether they intend to or not. Water does not resist remembrance. It embeds it, quietly, into sediments and chemistries and layers we may only discover long after silence falls. Perhaps this mirroring is part of why standing by the sea feels contemplative. The waves seem to answer in a rhythm slightly larger than ourselves, a rhythm that does not measure hours but epochs. Looking out, we sense we are gazing backward as much as forward, seeing patterns we cannot name but somehow recognize. The mirror is not perfect. It distorts and shifts, showing us resemblance rather than duplication. But it is enough to remind us that our moment, too, will become part of the reflection. Someday, our traces will be read by eyes not our own, the way we now read ammonites or chalk cliffs. And in that reading, we too will become metaphor, examples of fragility, of persistence, of hubris, of imagination, woven into the strata of time no matter what outcome unfolds. It is unsettling to confront this. We place value on our monuments, our words, our technologies, yet the ocean's mirror suggests that what lingers may be the humblest things. A shell, a plastic fragment, an isotope balanced slightly differently. These are the scales by which time remembers. They may outlast cathedrals, silencing our grand intentions and preserving only what was small enough, frequent enough, durable enough to endure. The ocean is impartial in its reflection. It does not ask what is worthy to remember. It keeps all records equally, folding them into silt, awaiting the patience of discovery. So when we look into the water today, perhaps what we see shimmering back is not only our face in the present moment, but also the faint suggestion of layers yet to come. Our reflection ripples not through hours, but through ages. The ocean reminds us that memory is never linear, always cyclical, always returning. And yet, if the sea reflects time back at us, if it reminds us of what has been and what may return, what of the forgotten currents themselves, the deep ancient circulations that might one day rise again, shifting oceans into patterns both familiar and strange? The ocean is never still, though sometimes its movements are slow enough to appear as silence. Beneath the surface, in depths beyond the measure of a single lifetime, circulation loops have always governed life and memory alike. During the Mesozoic, vast currents spread warmth across continents, carried oxygen into the deep, and drew nutrients back toward the light. They were the veins of the planet, subtle yet decisive, moving not in hours but in ages. And though their ancient rhythms seem to fade into geology, there is a quiet possibility that some may return. As climates shift again in our present, as warmth and imbalance seep into water once more, we may be reawakening parts of the ocean's memory. Forgotten currents stirring slowly, echoing patterns first rehearsed in the seas of the dinosaurs. These currents shaped entire chapters of the Mesozoic. When circulation was vigorous, seas grew rich, reefs thrived, plankton blooms covered the waters, predators surged in abundance. When circulation faltered, oxygen retreated, deep basins suffocated, extinction pulses tore through ecosystems in silence. Currents were the difference between oceanic cathedral and oceanic grave. They acted invisibly, yet their influence became visible in every fossil, every chalk bed, every shale deposit riddled with absence. To read them today is to see the oceans not only as stage, but as a living system of memory, breath, and recurrence. Scientists read these ancient pulses in the isotopic records of sediments. Shifts between light and heavy oxygen tell of temperature, shifts in carbon eco-productivity and nutrient circulation. Some layers reveal warmth so evenly distributed that polar seas became nearly tropical, a greenhouse circulation spreading heat across the globe. Other layers reveal stagnation, when waters failed to overturn and deep anoxia smothered thousands of lives. These events were not random. They were driven by currents that rose or collapsed in rhythms our present oceans may be rehearsing again. As climate warms today, the great conveyor belts of circulation shift, fresh water melts into salt, density gradients change. In the dark patience of the deep, forgotten patterns may be waiting for return. It is both humbling and unsettling to imagine. If ancient currents rise again, they may carry not ammonites and ichthyosaurs, but our own detritus, plastic, alloys, isotopes of industry, traces of agriculture. The ocean will fold these into circulation alongside plankton and fish, writing our moment into its archive. Yet in doing so, it may also rehearse old dangers. Stagnations like those that once suffocated the seas could return if overturning falters. Patterns that once spread greenhouse warmth might awaken again as the atmosphere leans toward imbalance. The mirror of recurrence whispers, currents are never lost, only delayed. They wait for conditions to call them back. And yet, this possibility offers learning. To understand future oceans, we do not look only forward. We must walk backward, into the Mesozoic seas, into the rhythms already written, into the silences already endured. Those oceans taught patience. They endured collapse and renewal, stagnation and bloom, silence and song. Their memory is there not to terrify, but to remind. The ocean has survived imbalance before, and though it changed profoundly, it never stopped breathing. If we listen carefully to the chemistry in stone, to the patterns in cores, to the echoes the fossils carry, we may glimpse what lies ahead when currents shift once more. Perhaps this is the greatest truth held by circulation. that it is not only water moving, but memory itself, returning in loops. The Mesozoic seas have not vanished. Their movements are folded into the ocean now, rhythms preserved in depths we rarely touch. To know them is not to predict with certainty but to feel continuity, to recognize that our present is part of a longer tide. Forgotten currents may rise again, but in their rising, they also return us to the oldest reminder the sea offers. Everything disperses, everything cycles, everything returns. And yet, if even these currents come back to us after millions of years, what of the deeper whispers still lingering at the bottom, the voices of the sea itself, those soft reminders that echo not through movement or form, but through silence that has been recording all along? We close not with certainty, but with listening. The ocean does not offer us stories in language, nor monuments carved deliberately to endure. Its memory is quieter, folded into isotopes, fossils, sediments pressed for millions of years into stone. To lean close to that silence is to realize the sea has been recording everything, not as we would record, with ink or code, but with patience beyond measure. Whispers woven in chemistry, spirals, disappearances, and returns. We are left to wonder whether we, too, might learn to remember alongside it. If only we breathe slowly enough, if only we allow our own rhythms to sync with the deeper tides. For the sea has never ceased whispering. It is only that we seldom pause long enough to hear. Those whispers rise in layers of chalk cliffs, in the fragile filigree of shells embedded within them, each one a brief life written permanently through mineral substitution. They rise in the isotopes of oxygen that tell us when oceans were warm, when they were cold, when silence pressed too deeply for life to endure. They rise in bone beds where frenzy was transformed into stillness, in reefs collapsed into rubble and then gently reborn. Every fragment is evidence not of permanence, but of persistence. Evidence that even as things collapse and vanish, the ocean chooses to carry memory forward in subtle ways. What humans read as absence is often only dispersal. What we call loss is often another form of patience. And when silence itself rules, the ocean does not forget. Its dark basins, anoxic and breathless, carry chemical scars that tell us what it was like when life could not breathe there. Its currents preserve the evidence of movement, even when we are not present to witness. Its sediments accumulate microlayers of existence, one atop another, the slowest calendar Earth possesses. If we sit with that realization, we begin to feel it not as science alone but as something like companionship. Time walking beside us, water carrying memory on our behalf. Perhaps we are not the only species that remembers. Perhaps memory itself is planetary, folded into matter, a characteristic of everything that persists. To breathe slowly in the presence of the ocean is to feel this connection. The air we draw into our lungs still carries atoms once dissolved in Mesozoic seas. The oxygen we live upon was cycled through plankton older than the continents as we know them. Each inhale is a continuity, each exhale part of a dialogue. We are not apart from the ocean's memory, we are part of it. Our bones, too, carry calcium once circulated as shells. Our own cells trace back to breaths first drawn by microbial life in primal waters. In this way, every heartbeat carries echoes of tides far older than humanity. If we allow this realization to soften us, we might acknowledge the humility it requires. We are temporary, like reefs, like ammonites, like predator empires that once swam in certainty only to vanish. Yet temporary does not mean forgotten. Just as the ocean preserved spirals in stone, so too may traces of our presence linger, whether as plastic layered into silt, altered isotope balances in ice and water, or even ruins pressed into the geological calendar. The question is not whether oceans will remember us, but how they will, as wisdom or as debris, as melody added to their chorus, or as noise pressed into silence. Perhaps the deepest whisper of all is this, that memory is not only about keeping the past, but also about teaching patience. The sea does not rush to reveal its archives. It unfolds its records slowly, in fragments and traces, requiring us to linger, to listen, to accept that we will never hold the whole story. We are invited to replace certainty with reverence, to find meaning in echoes rather than in commands. What the deep whispers is not instruction, but reminder. Reminder that time is larger than us, memory broader, silence more articulate than any song. And so, as we close, we do so not with a conclusion, but with an open ear. To sit quietly before the sea, to breathe slowly and watch its moving surface, is to enter into dialogue with deep time. The Mesozoic, the Paleocene, the epochs dissolved into stone. They are still here, shimmering in every ripple we see today. The ocean remembers, and in rare moments, if we lean softly into its silence, we may remember with it. Not because the water speaks in words, but because it carries us, envelopes us, and, in its gentle rhythm, tells us that forgetting was never absolute. The ocean has been whispering all along, and yet, as the tide turns once more and silence stretches between pulse and return, we are left with one final question. If even oceans can remember, what will they carry of us into the far futures that follow, when our own voices have long dissolved into stone?